Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is story about what if Naruto becomes the newest member of Anbu after the Valley of End part 1. Before I start, please do support for more amazing content and comments for part 2. Do consider to subscribe my channel and share my video to your friends and check out the description as well. Let's start the video. There was an unusual silence draped over the three figures standing in the Hokage's office. It was thick and tense and tasted of uneasiness and hesitation, as they had been discussing things of vital importance that none of them wanted to talk about. Despite the detailed reports, there were still blanks to fill and things left to ponder that were not at all pleasant. Things had taken an unexpected turn, and even though they were three of the most competent ninja of the village, they still needed to tread carefully. Tsunade was sitting stiffly in the Hokage's seat, slumped down on the desk, as she let out a soft sigh, her elbows slipped to hit a pile of paperwork, which managed not to fall. Brown eyes fluttered close as she slowly massaged her temples, a last attempt to make her migraine recede. She was good at ignoring people and had successfully managed to ignore the two shinobi standing there for a good 15 minutes after hours spent talking, but Tsunade was aware that she could not postpone this any longer. The last few days had been vexing, and even though she would deny it if asked, she was tired, anxious, weary and most of all, pissed off. Above all though, she felt old. It was at times like these that she felt the brunt of her own age fall back on her shoulders, a weight full of pain that reminded her she was no longer the 25-years-old woman she'd once been, no matter how many medical jutsu she used to seem younger. As a ninja, Tsunade had seen her fair share of despair, pain and blood. It was enough to have her hold many regrets, and for a good part of her life, she had thought this would only mean losing hope, day after day, running away and knowing her attempts to distance herself from the past were useless. Then she had been reminded that she had a home to return to, a place she still loved and that had welcomed her when she had returned. Not all of her life had been pain, and it was good to remember that too. Still, that didn't change the fact that she was not young anymore. Having to deal with Hokage business was most assuredly not how she'd wanted to spend the last few years of her life. Despite that though, Tsunade had never felt more alive. Accepting her past, her responsibilities, had not been an easy step to make, and deciding not to run was even harder, but she could now look back with bittersweet eyes and still think this was the right decision to make. Konoha had not felt familiar, not like the warm place one could call home, but Tsunade had long since realized home was not just a place to live. It was people to belong to, it was being appreciated and welcome, and Konoha, no matter its faults, was that place, and home was also the person who had saved her over and over until she could stand on her own again. As newer generations took place of the older ones, Tsunade was finally starting to see why Sarutobi had been so sure about the future of the Fire Nation. Looking ahead rather than being burdened by the past, accepting and moving on without forgetting that was a strength she had not properly learned until meeting Naruto. Embrace the memories but not allowing them to hold her back, glance at the future she still had in front of her, protect the village and its people, and feel once again alive. She had done that, had accepted her duties as a shinobi of Konoha, regaining that peace of mind she'd only felt once before, when her brother and Dan had been alive. And the village Konoha was her village. She belonged to it, she loved it. That was the legacy her loved ones had left to her, and she would protect it to the best of her abilities. This was tomorrow's hope, after all. That did not mean it was easy. Determination born from blood and sweat gave her strength, but it was not infinite. The Godin was tired, and the state of Konoha after the Sound's attack was almost discouraging. Of the many problems, the worst was the political issue she was facing, and it was the one she dreaded the most. Uchiha Sasuke, the last member of the much glorified Uchiha clan, had escaped his sensei's surveillance, running from the village in order to join a high-ranked missing nin. The further ramifications of this were even worse. The missing nin was Orochimaru, once also part of Konoha, renowned across all hidden villages for being strong and ruthless, and for his hatred towards his once village. Sasuke had showed little care for what that would imply and had even harmed his teammate, who had been dispatched to bring him back. He would have actually managed to escape successfully if Naruto hadn't been there to stop him. Unfortunately, his attempt, although fruitless, still placed Tsunade in a bad position. An attempted betrayal of the village was no laughing matter, and Sasuke's position as the last of the powerful bloodline clan was not going to offer much leeway. On the surface things seemed under control. The Uchiha was back into the village and nobody was aware of the situation aside for a handful of high-ranked people, but Tsunade knew it would be hard to make the Uchiha settle down and prevent him from running away again. Considering the instable position Konoha was occupying after Sandaime Sarutobi-sama had died by the hands of the same missing nin Sasuke had tried to join, if the news of the attempted defection of Uchiha Sasuke were to reach the ears of the neighboring countries, Konoha would face more trouble than it was worth and its pride would take a harsh blow. It wasn't a secret that the Uchiha clan had been exterminated and the responsible had fled the village, and finding out that the remaining heir of the family had attempted defection, it would be a downfall. It was said that the higher position one had, the harder it would fall, then Konoha was doomed to fall hard. All of this over a stupid kid's hot-blooded decision. Of course, ninja defecting from their villages wasn't uncommon. There were thousands missing in around the 5 elemental countries who found themselves unable to follow the rules or simply broke down under the pressure or wanted more power at their disposal. Most of them remained nameless to the public and only the bingo books had detailed information on them unless the Newtonin decided to make a name for themselves and those only served to bring shame to their original village. Politically speaking, Sasuke had been a valuable asset, belonging to a loved coveted clan. He had been worshipped and admired during his whole childhood, protected and pushed on the path of a ninja in order to serve the village. As a symbol of power, the last Uchiha was still loyal. If the news of his attempted defection were to reach potential opponents, they would use it against Konoha and destroy its political standing with the other villages and the daimyo. Other ninja villages would feed on it, competing and teaming up against Konoha, week after the death of its last kage and after its almost destruction. People would not trust Konoha with missions and packs, which it depended on to get back into gear, and following this the Fire Lord himself would deny Konoha his financial aid. Her mind filled with those dreadful thoughts, Tsunade straightened her back and looked up at the two shinobi, still silently waiting for her to speak up. She was the Hokage now. All of this was her responsibility, and avoiding such a horrifying situation was top priority. Cold brown eyes regained control over her emotions, and she took a deep cleansing breath. Is he okay? Her tone was soft and worried, but her face did not betray her emotions. His safety would always come first, even before her village's concern. Kakashi, who had until then remained with his back pressed against the wall, looking nonchalant, nodded warily, his only visible eye narrowed. The part of his face that was not covered by his mask and hit eye was stony, but one could easily see he was relieved, not just weary. He had never been this easy to read in a long while, but that also made him look older. His constant worrying over his students had overwhelmed his past defenses, and guilt and regrets were now piling up inside him. He supposed he'd have to face them at one point, but now was not the time. Yes, he finally replied, his shoulders tensing a bit without showing. When the rescue team and I reached the Valley of End, both of them were still conscious, but Sasuke did not appear to object his return here. Naruto passed out on the way home due to fatigue, as his wounds were healing already on their own. The masked shinobi hesitated a bit, but one look from the Godame forced him to continue. I tried to question Sasuke about what happened at the valley, but he would not answer. He kept repeating he would not break another promise and stated coolly more than once that he won't try something like this ever again. The Hokage sighed, but nodded at him. Naruto was fine, and in an instant most of her worries ceased to exist, cooling down her steely resolve. Sasuke was also back. That wouldn't mean much if they did not make sure he wouldn't leave again, but it was a start. Questioning the Uchiha would be the best alternative for now, but she would wait him to heal completely before ordering someone to proceed with the Inquisition. Thanks, Kakashi, she said, her tone unwavering. You can leave now. The Jounin nodded. I will be with Sasuke and Naruto at the hospital if you need me, he muttered before vanishing on the spot, a small cloud of smoke in his place. Tsunade shifted her gaze to the remaining shinobi. For a while, silence reigned on them once more, but the two could understand each other without speaking. What do you think? Jiraiya finally asked, his rough voice showing his concern. He had been deeply worried, just like Tsunade had, because the blonde brat had wormed into his heart just as much as he had done in hers. The toad Sanin moved towards the wall next to the window, unable to stand being in small constricting spaces for long. Jiraiya sought solace by leaning against the window's frame instead, looking outside. I am glad they are both back, Tsunade sighed, shaking her head once again. Many problems will be avoided thanks to Naruto, but I am more concerned about Naruto than any of Konoha's political schemes. Jiraiya grunted, understanding her unsaid words and not so privately agreeing with her. As the Sanin watched, Tsunade pulled out a bottle of sake from underneath a desk, sliding out 2 small cups from a drawer. Her skills at hiding alcohol from Shizune were getting better, and in a moment like this they needed it. Pouring out the clear liquid for both of them, Tsunade let her gaze meet Jiraiya's before the two gulped their cups down. The sake burned down her throat and she sighed silently, enjoying the strong feeling and the warmth. I want to take the brat with me. Jiraiya knew that his words would not be easily accepted by Tsunade, but he had to talk with her about it anyway. She looked only mildly surprised but not pleased, and he looked away. Come again? Tsunade waited for him to repeat himself. She wasn't exactly shocked because she knew Jiraiya was trying to make up for the lost time with Naruto, but she had not expected him to offer so soon. Unable to look at his old teammate, Jiraiya turned around, moving his gaze to the village he could see from the window of Tsunade's office, then slowly looked up at the 5 stony faces above him. The Hokage Mountain was a sight visible from every spot in Konoha, a pleasant connection to the past. The 4Kage looked down at him, ready to judge him for his words, and not for the first time Jiraiya wondered if the protection that most shinobi and civilians felt when looking up at them was also meant for someone like Naruto, who needed it the most. The village had been founded by Tsunade's grandfather, one of the first two Kage of Konoha, and Jiraiya, in a way or another, had met all the previous Hokage. All of them had wanted to protect the place they had loved so much and the people who lived within it. Shadame, Nidame, Sandame and Yondame had always thought about Konoha first and their own lives last, loving the place in their own, personal way. He wondered, with a flicker of worry, if they would be supportive of his decision or not. If Yondame would still trust him to make decisions for Naruto, with the way he had abandoned the kid and the village before. Tsunade, just like them, had responsibilities. Even if her own love for the village came second only to Naruto's well-being, as a Hokage she had to think of the whole Konoha first and foremost. Jiraiya suspected that if something happened to make her take a side, there would be no doubt which one of the two Tsunade would protect first, Konoha or Naruto. That was also part of the reason Jiraiya wanted to take Naruto under his personal tutelage, so she would not have to ever face this decision. He had no real ties to Konoha, except for the few people he cared for that lived within the village, and that was also why Jiraiya would never be Hokage. Like Tsunade, he would play someone else before Konoha, but unlike Tsunade, he could do it without repercussions. He had no obligations to think about Konoha first, and that was why he could grab Naruto and get him away from here. That boy needed to leave and get stronger outside of Konoha. How could his thirst for knowledge and attention be granted without leaving? Konoha was stifling Naruto, rather than nurturing him, and Jiraiya had experienced firsthand what it meant to come to dislike a place you were supposed to love. Naruto needed his spaces and some time to flourish. He would do that, and more, if he accepted Jiraiya's offer to train alongside him. That was because Naruto had yet to learn to love Konoha fully, the true requirement to become Hokage. Yes, Naruto loved Konoha, but what he loved was the idea of it, the ideal Sandame had offered him. Enraptured by the man's words, Naruto had vowed to protect his friends and the people he cared for, but he did not love unconditionally the village. He would slowly break down under the weight, and Jiraiya could not allow it. If the kid couldn't stray from the path he had picked for himself, then Jiraiya would do what he could to aid him on that path. Naruto was, after all, a child. There were many things he had yet to learn and see with his own eyes before he could understand things for what they were and not through glittery-tinged glasses. His dream was mostly idealized, and he needed to grasp the darker sides just as well. He would have to learn there was no need to hurry, control his powers, and most of all, he needed to open his eyes to the truth and finally decide if he would be a good Hokage. The Hokage's power and position could be easily overestimated, and maybe Naruto had just shaped his desire to be accepted into the role of the leader, and Jiraiya knew that feeling too well. But Jiraiya was not the Hokage. That was why Jiraiya wanted to show Naruto the world outside of Konoha. Before he could collapse under the obligations and pain, he would offer him a taste of what a shinobi really was and help him make a conscious decision. I want to take Naruto with me on a 3-year training period, he finally said, turning around to look at her again. I am aware that Akatsuki won't attack Naruto for the next few years and Sasuke is safe in the village. Orochimaru had to possess another body or risk dying, so as long as he's guarded, there won't be problems for at least 3 years. That gives enough time to plan what to do about Orochimaru's goals with the Uchiha and to give Naruto enough training. Tsunade licked her lips, she was listening, although she didn't seem to like Jiraiya's careless mention of their former teammate. This is the best option for him, Tsunade Haim, and you know it. You have seen his eyes, the way civilians and shinobi alike react to him. He needs to leave and grow on his own, and if the council tries something, I will protect him fully without fearing any double-crossing from them, he silently added. But the start, Tsunade realized she was clutching the desk too tightly and forced herself to loosen her grip, leaving 10 small dents in the wood made by her nails. She had easily caught on Jiraiya's unspoken words, and she knew he was right. And yet Naruto was the reason for her return to the village. The part of her was not ready to let him leave, but she had to think about his well-being first and foremost, and that was, Jiraiya pressed on. I will take care of him, Tsunade, this is a promise. I care for him just as much as you do, and I will make him strong, he tried to reassure her former teammate. He wasn't one to make shallow promises, after all. If there are any problems with allowing a genin to leave, we'll deal with them one by one. But not even the elders can negate I am the best protection Naruto can have against Akatsuki. Tsunade had the sudden urge to stand up and hit him, all be damned, but she knew she'd have to eventually relent to the white-haired man's wishes. For Naruto. That was all for him. Your words mean nothing if I'm the one you ask for permission first. You'd have to find Naruto and ask him yourself first, then come to me, she muttered, taking a hold of her second sake cup and downing it in one gulp. I admit there is a point to Jiraiya's madness, but I do loathe to see him go. Jiraiya nodded at the acceptance he saw in her eyes, his shoulders relaxing slightly. I will go right now, then, he smiled at her, receiving a tired smile back for once, they had not bickered. It felt good. Before he could leave, there was a sudden chakra flare that alerted both Sannin. It was a deliberate clear pulse, made to warn the Hokage that someone was coming, subtle enough that only those within the Hokage office could feel it, so not to alert the guards by the door outside. It was a signal only used by the Hokage's personal guards, the Anbu division, and the blank masks belonging to the hunters, meant to reassure the Hokage that the incoming shinobi was no threat. Both Jiraiya and Tsunade tensed as a figure appeared in front of the Hokage's desk, without the use of a smoke curtain, kneeling in front of the woman with his head facing down. He was tall and looked no older than 30, with dark brownish hair cut short on his head. His frame was well built, but still lean and perfectly shaped under the dark outfit, while his face was covered by a white mask with black lines, whose shapes formed the features of a panther. Tsunade lifted an eyebrow. As his entrance and his appearance confirmed, the shinobi belonged to the Anbu team and was in fact the captain of the first squad, the commander of the corps, and one of Tsunade's strongest allies within Konoha. The man's name code was famous throughout the village and even outside, whose loyalty was strong and unwavering. Anbu, as opposed to normal ranking shinobi, took orders directly from the Hokage in charge and were trained to answer to the Kage's will alone. They did not respond to the authority of the Elder Council, nor to the clan head's council either, and were a secluded category, separated from the usual shinobi rankings. They were the elite of the village, respected and feared for their skills and courage, Tsunade's personal guard during public situations, and first in line in battle and ambush. There were not many differences between normal teams and Anbu ones. Each squad had a team leader and 3 members, and sometimes 2 or 3 squads would work together on missions. The main difference between normal shinobi and Anbu was that to protect their identities, Anbu members wore masks, each of them unique and depicting an animal face painted in black on white. Since Anbu had the most difficult, dangerous missions, their identities were heavily guarded, and outside of the Anbu headquarters, only the Hokage knew the identity of each member, that is, unless it involved shinobi from important clans, who took pride in their strength, and often allowed a small circle of people to know their position within the Anbu. During peaceful times, the number of Anbu teams in service was 5, but during war times it could increase exponentially. Squad members took orders from their leaders, and all of them only answered to the main squad's captain, who was the corps' commander. Opposed to the rest of the Anbu, the identity of the commander head was a sealed secret that not even fellow Anbu knew. Even the Hokage, the only person who could see the commander maskless, preferred to forget having this knowledge and never abused of this fact. Between the ranks of the Anbu, identities were often shared amongst teammates, some deciding not to share it at all, some allowing the whole division to know. As it was, Anbu protected their own identity as well as their partners. Loyal and secretive, one of their assignments was to protect the village and hunt down traitors. The Hunters division was especially trained for that purpose, even though they also got missions that ranked from A special to S, which were usually assassinations or undercover missions in enemy territory. Jounin shinobi were allowed to take up to A, although there were special cases where certain Jounin skills overlapped those of the Anbu, and they were allowed higher ranking missions. To be accepted within the Anbu division, a shinobi didn't need to go through any standard exam or reach a certain level. Outsiders thought that to qualify as an Anbu choice, one had to be at least of Jounin level, but in truth the troops held separate exams individually, offering a position to someone they deemed worthy, or by accepting the Hokage's suggested choices every year or so. The chosen ones would be placed under supervision for a month, and they would then be trained intensively to even out their skills and enhance their personal traits. After that period, they would get tested to see whether they were skilled enough to be accepted into the division. Since Anbu life could interfere with normal ranking missions, and that protecting their own identity would bring out questions that could not be answered, most of the ninja and active duty that belonged to the Anbu troops were uninterested in formalities and never took the Jounin exam. Some ninja appeared to be meek and quiet, living a simple life with low-ranking missions to fit the budget and thus keep under the radar, avoiding overlapping missions with their second life as an Anbu member. Others faked retirement from active duty for one reason or another, dedicating themselves to high-rank secret missions and using a simple job in the village as a cover-up. The few ninja that actually decided to take and pass the Jounin exam were only the ones that strictly had to, either because their clan expected them to, knowing about their position and thus leaking out the news to gain pride for the clan, or because it would have seemed strange not to. Some simply enjoyed the rush or the need to look strong in front of their village. Anbu never cared for age, rank or families and bloodlines. Being accepted within the troops was merely thanks to personal skills, individual tests and training, and to actually be accepted was both a great honor and a great responsibility. Since flooding the Hokage with daily missions reports was unthinkable, Tsunade, as her predecessors, received the visit of one of the squad leaders for a weekly report. Eventually she could ask for a specific Anbu to be present to inquire more about certain missions, but to actually see the commander kneeling in front of her was not an usual occurrence. She knew instantly that something was up. The commander's code name was Hidoku, the only name this particular shinobi would be known as for as long as he kept his role in the Anbu, and nothing else. Anbu masks only reflected the person behind them, and Hayu was just as dangerous and feral as the animal painted on his mask was. Okage-sama, the man said, voice deep and laced with respect. Tsunade observed him for a second, relieved for his presence, but somewhat curious as to why he would be there, and then nodded sharply to Jiraiya, signaling him he could stay. She returned her attention to the Anbu. "Panther, what is the meaning of your appearance here? I have already received your weekly report yesterday. Has something happened that I am not aware of?" The kneeling ninja finally stood up, keeping his back slightly slouched in order to appear shorter than the Hokage herself, and cleared his throat. He was there for a reason, and he knew he would be walking on eggshells if he could not explain himself properly to his new Hokage. "Tsunade Hokage-sama, I am here for a pledge. Anbu troops ask for the permission to start a test for a new member." Tsunade couldn't restrain a small twitch of confusion from showing on her face. As far as she knew, all 5 teams were intact, no member had died yet, and the usual recruits period was still a couple months away. What Hayu was requesting was obviously a special test. Why were the Anbu asking for one now? "A new member?" she asked, intertwining her fingers in front of her face and leaning her elbows on the desk, ignoring the bottle of sake and the documents still scattered there. "Are you planning on creating a 6th 4-man team?" Tsunade had suspected for a while that Anbu were feeling less secure after the Chunin exams. They had also been fooled by Orochimaru, and the result had been Sandame's death. That had been a huge blow for everybody, but for people who had been loyal to the Hokage first and foremost, the shame burnt even more. They had failed the only person they valued above any other, who had been commanding them for decades. Hayu hesitated for a second, uncertain on how to approach the subject with Lady Hokage, but there was no way he could back down. "Some formerly retired members have asked to be reinstalled to active duty, and they were accepted back," he said, his tone even but steady. "The 6th team is however comprised of just 3 members, and I am here to request permission for a new trainee to be given a chance." Tsunade blinked in surprise, and casting a quick glance at Jiraiya, she saw the same curiosity in his eyes as well. To have old members reinstalled in the Anbu ranks was almost unheard of, since very few Anbu members were allowed to retire unless crippled or seriously ill, and they were closely monitored to prevent any leakage of information. Even so, fewer ever asked to come back. Tsunade only knew of 2, ever. The woman forced her shoulders to relax. She would have to meet the members beforehand, and since she had no way to know who they were, given they had been on active duty with her predecessor, not her, this would prove to be a pleasurable distraction from her current set of problems. More so, if the Anbu were asking for a new member, even though it was just so they could fill up their new team, that would be something to regard with attention. Only shinobi with great potential or skills were allowed to give it a try. After all, of the many ninja that Anbu tested, only a few managed to pass the test and were thus confirmed trainees. Most were disappointed by their own failure and would go back to their lives with the resolve to improve, their memories of the Anbu headquarters location erased from their mind. Rejected candidates usually returned for the following tryouts, while others simply gave up. Anbu that dropped out from active duty, depending on their status, mental stability and eventual injuries, also had their memories of the headquarters location erased, unless the Anbu decided to still keep in contact with them to use them as information gatherers from outside the troops. "I accept the meeting with the members," Tsunade finally said, nodding to the man. "As for the request for a new member, I need to know their name, current status, and a motivation for why you selected that person." Jiraiya smirked, shaking his head inwardly at Tsunade's business-like behavior. Despite all her mourning and bitching about it, the Hokage position fit her like a glove. Hayu hesitated again, as if pondering how to exactly tell the Hokage about his chosen one, then sighed, knowing there wouldn't be a way to sweeten it up. "It is a young male we have been observing for quite some time, assessing his current performances and his progresses as a shinobi of Konohagakure," he started. "He has talent but needs a serious training, one that can unlock his skills and capabilities without interruptions, a rigid training to shape what now is raw and rough." Tsunade narrowed her eyes, listening to the man's words. "So you are saying that, even though if he is talented and has the potential to be an Anbu, he is still not ready yet?" Hayu nodded. "Our training regimen will polish what is there without fail, and it won't take much longer for him to be ready," he assured, sounding sure of himself. Anbu have often acquired members for the sole purpose of training their raw potential, so it would not be the first time we have chosen someone who is not already fit for the position. This shinobi has good skills and strength, and all he requires is attention and constant focus. Zero. Tsunade grimaced. Something in the man's tone was making her stomach squirm uneasily. And who would this promising ninja be? Hayu exhaled slowly, preparing himself for the outburst that was sure to come. Uzumaki Naruto. As he stepped into the hospital room, Kakashi was suddenly aware of 3 things. The first was how the beds were placed within the room, far from each other, which differed from the usual room formation with the beds placed closer to each other. Kakashi was sure that neither Naruto nor Sasuke had been the ones to move the beds like that because the first was still unconscious and the second was weakened and currently sealed on the bed. The second was the crowd of nurses around Sasuke's bed, and by the Uchiha's displeased expression, it was clear he was not enjoying it. Naruto's side of the room was also unusually bare, making the Jounin inwardly frown. He had seen Naruto's friends come with get-well cards and Hinata had brought flowers, but there was nothing there. To make up for that though, Iruka was sitting next to the sleeping teen, eyes focused on his resting figure, looking calm and plainly ignoring the nurses. The third and most important thing was how the nurses were pointedly ignoring Naruto's side and Iruka. He didn't look unattended. Tsunade would never allow that, but Kakashi was sure that the only one taking care of the sleeping teen was Iruka. The copy nin paused only for a split second, committing to memory the nurses' faces for later when he reported their unprofessional attitude to the head of the hospital, then moved to Naruto's side. Iruka heard the approaching Jounin and looked up, eyes tired and weary. "How is he?" Kakashi asked conversationally, tone cheerful, but eyes sharply focused on his sleeping student. "Relatively fine, and after I scolded the nurses, they've taken on ignoring me," Iruka snorted, eyes taking on a dangerous glint. "They only did the minimum required, patching up his wounds and bandaging them. Thankfully he is recovering quickly. I guess this is one of the few times I'm glad he has that," the Chunin chuckled. "He should wake up soon." "Good?" Kakashi nodded, relieved. The Naruto on the bed was too pale, too quiet to compare with the Naruto he knew. He was young and yet had an enormous potential, and Kakashi felt a growing dread at his own actions towards both him and Sasuke. Supporting one student at the expenses of another, what had he been thinking? Hiding his eagerness to train Sasuke as his pupil under the false pretense of helping him master the Sharingan. Kakashi was ashamed of himself. He had always despised favoritism, but his words had been those of a hypocrite. He had not noticed, nor had he taken care of it, and he just hoped he would be allowed a way to fix his mistakes. He had refused to see Naruto as his own person, seeing shadows of his old sensei and Obito in him, and had pushed away almost unconsciously, looking at Sasuke and seeing himself in the young genin. Blinded by what he could see in Sasuke, what he'd deluded himself to see, he had failed to take notice of the darkness hiding inside the teen's heart. What Sasuke had learned from him had been used for revenge, while what Naruto would learn would serve him to protect. "Naruto will be okay, you don't have to worry," Kakashi told Iruka in a low voice. They both paused to look at Sasuke's side. The nurses were finally gone, and the teen was now staring stubbornly out of the window, ignoring the two adults who could still see him peek at them at Naruto every now and then. Kakashi could say he'd grown to understand Sasuke, even though he hadn't been able to see for a long time, and he had to wonder whether Tsunade would allow him to keep the memories of what had happened at the Valley of End for himself, or if she'd make him break just to know. One thing was obvious, though there was no hatred in Sasuke's eyes, and Kakashi had to strain his senses to feel the foul smell of possession coming from him. With a sigh, Kakashi left the hospital. Both Tsunade and Jiraiya were left speechless. They stared at the Anbu commander with the same stunned stare, almost expecting him to take back his words, but that did not happen. Hai remained silent, defiant, though under his mask his face betrayed his tension. He would stand his ground, this was far too important not to. "Tsunade-sama, Jiraiya-sama," he finally spoke, staring at the two Sannin. He would include the white-haired Sennin in his speech due to his well-known familial love for the teen. "I formally request the permission to test one Uzumaki Naruto as the new trainee for the Anbu troops." "No." Tsunade replied, without even thinking. "I won't allow him to take that path." This belief laced her words. Naruto did not have the skills or the mental attitude to be an Anbu. He had no experience yet, he was not disillusioned, and Tsunade was secretly afraid to face the moment he would come back from a mission after having killed for the first time. Normal ninja could avoid killing unless it was strictly necessary, but for Anbu he wouldn't have that luxury. He was too young, too inexperienced, he had yet to understand what the true life of a shinobi was, aside for teammates running away and organizations seeking out tailed beasts. Normal shinobi life was different, darker than the petty missions genin were allowed to take. No, Naruto couldn't give his pledge to the Anbu. Not him. Hayu sighed, then straightened his back, mentally preparing to challenge his Hokage. She was stubborn, but he would not back down until she could see he was right. "With all due respect, Hokage-sama, he has the qualities to become a great shinobi if allowed to train with us," he countered, trying to reason with her. The boy had raw talent that was being wasted. But Hayu's reasons for insisting with the Hokage had actually not much to do with the opportunity to add a potentially strong shinobi to his ranks, and certainly had nothing to do with the Kyuubi residing inside Naruto's seal. More than to any other Hokage, the Anbu had especially been loyal to the Yondaime, the only man who had inspired not just loyalty, but trust within the Anbu corps. He had treated them not just as faithful weapons, but also as people, like the rest of the shinobi and the villagers. Yondaime understood the truth behind the facade of the Anbu. They had been there during the Kyuubi's attack, they had seen the depths of Yondaime's grief over losing his wife, they had seen the determination flashing through his eyes, and the pain when he had given up his life in order to complete the seals that would chain the beast once more, this time in his little baby's body. They were there for it all, silent testimony of a great sacrifice filled with hope, there to mourn on their own for the loss of their leader, of a comrade and a friend. And unlike Minato and Kushina, they had been there for the aftermath. That little baby left behind to take the brunt of the village's pain, of a hatred misplaced and fired against a kid rather than at a beast, something Yondaime would have never believed to be possible. The Anbu had guarded Naruto's life for the first few years of his life, preventing grieving ninja and even villagers from attacking him directly, but even they could not be everywhere, because after Kyuubi's destruction, they had to do their own part to make Konoha rise again. Naruto had not been as alone as he thought, but the Anbu had been unable to do much either way, because they couldn't interact directly with the little kid, and they were forced to do what was best for the village first, as per Sandaime's orders. But they knew. Anbu were aware that Naruto was not the Kyuubi, merely the container. Not a demon, but simply an unfortunate sacrifice. Sandaime Sarutobi-sama had forbidden Anbu from taking little Naruto under their wing, partly because he wanted the kid to grow up like a normal kid, away from the bloodshed that being in the secret corps was inevitable, thinking that protecting the kid, rather than telling him the truth, would make him understand in the long run, not to mention his determination to keep the rest of the council calm and keep Naruto safe as much as he could without taking him under his tutelage. The council had wanted to kill the demon, not understanding that doing so would only let Kyuubi break free again, and afterwards they had wanted to deploy him to their service, making him grow as a human weapon with no identity, and they had been denied that too. Keeping him away from ninja until he was at the academy, keeping him down low and hiding from him the truth was meant to make him seem weak, not a threat. It had worked, but to the expense of Naruto's own growth, self-worth and happiness. Hayu still felt regret over his inability to help. If the Sandaime had allowed one of them to gain custody of Naruto since the very start, none of this would have ever happened, but they had been unable to do anything but watch from afar, protecting him as much as they could without interfering. Now things were different, yet a mirror of the past. Konoha had been attacked again, and the Anbu had to get busy again to protect and aid its growth, but now Naruto was no little kid in need of protection. He needed guidance, an adult steering his life in the right direction. He could be given the chance to follow the Anbu, be taught by them and learn and grow. Hayu wanted Tsunade to understand he knew that she cared for Naruto, it was a gift that Naruto kept spreading around, making bonds with people who would have never thought of liking him. She would only want his best, and she hadn't been there before. Hayu had. Tsunade-sama, he looked at her in the eyes, we will take care of the Yondaime's legacy without fail. His words made both the older ninjas stiffen. Something that had never been spoken aloud ever since the fourth's death was hanging in the air between them, raw and bare, almost accusing, and in Jiraiya's mind that stung like the blade of a katana. It was a low blow, but one Hayu had not hesitated in deploying. The Hokage's hands were trembling as she poured herself a third cup of sake, gulping it down with her eyes covered by blonde bangs, not speaking. She wouldn't give the man the chance to see how deeply his words had touched her. Naruto has to leave the village, Jiraiya interrupted harshly. His decision was being challenged, and he didn't want to allow someone else to take care of Naruto. It was his duty, and even though he acted like the team bothered him most of the time, it was the opposite. He was old and had a hard time learning how to care for someone else, especially so young, but it was his duty, not someone else's. I would be taking him with me for 3 years. Hayu turned towards him, his mask hiding his face, but not the tension in his body. Staying in the village only poses a danger to his growth, Jiraiya continued, voice not louder than a hiss. He needs to learn that there is a world outside of Konoha and that he can love his village by learning how things work outside, in the rest of the lands, his eyes narrowed. Anbu is not the right path for him. He will stay under my tutelage. Hayu shook his head. That would be wrong, Jiraiya-sama was a strong shinobi, yes, but they were all aware that he was running away. Before Naruto, Jiraiya himself would have admitted it, and it was true he was changing only because of Naruto's influence, but that meant Jiraiya saw himself in Naruto. He would take Naruto away from the village, and then the problems would still be there in the end, haunting them both during their travels. Naruto would grow under Jiraiya's tutelage, but other parts of him would not mature. Anbu will offer the best protection in such circumstances. Jiraiya-sama can continue traveling on his own, gather information without having to split his attention between that and Naruto, Hayu replied, keeping his voice firm and steady. We will erase his identity and keep him in our hideout to train, within the village grounds, where he can observe without being influenced. The boy will need to face the truth with his own eyes and confront it. He paused, staring Jiraiya straight into his eyes. We are going to offer him a purpose. Tsunade licked her dry lips, breathing deeply for a few seconds as the two men stared each other down, neither stepping back from the challenge. A purpose. Tsunade knew that Naruto needed to grow, to learn. She also knew that his idealistic dream would hit against a barrier of reality, and he needed to learn that reality and dreams were different and could only overlap when all was out in the open, no delusions and no hiding. As for how much it hurt her to think this was Naruto's decision to make. He might be young, but they were shinobi. Protecting Naruto from the inevitable would not aid him in the least. Running away. These words echoed through Jiraiya's mind like boiling oil, bitter and accusing and brutally direct. Hayu had probably meant to be blunt, not offensive, and the fact that Jiraiya felt attacked meant they were ringing painfully true. Would it really be like running away if Naruto left the village to train with him? Did Hidoku have a point with his accusation? Jiraiya dispelled such thoughts. Naruto is an Anbu, he couldn't see it. Despite his determination, he would never pass the exam, and what if he did? Would he even accept a tryout? And if Jiraiya allowed him to try, only to see him fail, wouldn't that waste the little time they had before Akatsuki returned? Naruto has the rights to decide, Tsunade murmured, not looking up from her joined hands. But he has to know there is another option as well. The Sennin stared worriedly at her, she had to be on his side, even when she wasn't really, but they had to make joint force against the idea of Naruto joining the Anbu. He was too young, too inexperienced and clueless about the life of ninja to find it out that way. He was not ready and probably would never be. It was just nonsense. He will be a great shinobi, that is for sure, he will be Hokage one day, but Anbu? No, never. Naruto could not follow their rules. And even knowing that, Jiraiya knew he had to consider Naruto as an adult in ninja standards. No matter his age, he was a shinobi of Konoha. He would need to know all the options offered to him, and whatever decision he took, it would be his own. Jiraiya would have to agree and go along with it because he cared for Naruto. Not because he was his old student's legacy, but simply because Naruto was Naruto. Hayu noticed Jiraiya's shoulders drop ever so slightly and felt a surge of satisfaction, knowing he had won. Now he only needed to take care of the rest, to make sure the rest would run smoothly. With a quick bow to the two older shinobi, the panther disappeared without a trace from the Hokage's office, once again without smoke to hide his departure. When Iruka finally left the hospital, it was already dawn. Naruto had yet to wake up, but Iruka had every intention to stay by his side until he regained consciousness, and if the nurses tried to politely send him off, he was going to put his foot down and file a complaint with the head of the hospital. Since that meant the Hokage, he knew they would back down, and he had to smirk at the thought. Hurrying down the street, the Chunin teacher let idly thoughts run through his mind. He wondered if his laundry would be dry when he got home, and then he wondered if he'd have enough food to make himself dinner before going to bed early. He needed some rest, as the following morning he'd have to get his class to the academy training grounds for a shuriken throwing practice lesson. He still had nightmares from his previous weaponry class, and there were holes in his pants he kept discovering even weeks after. Teachers had it hard, and he sort of envied the Team Jounin teachers, as they only had to control 3 teenagers each. He had an entire class of pre-teens, ready to demolish the academy, not really a walk in the park. Young kids thinking they were extremely gifted with weapons could be scary, especially when they were allowed to handle shiny and pointy things. Most of them had a bad aim, of course, and the huge ego only children could have, which made them feel like they were on top of the world. It took him all his skills and experience to keep them from hurting themselves, or him. If he didn't love teaching, he'd wonder why he had opted for such job in the first place, though at first his decision had nothing to do with Iruka-sensei. He turned around, blinking in surprise when he saw who was approaching him, his former student Haruno Sakura, Naruto's teammate. She waved her hand as she approached him, and Iruka stopped to wait for her. At a close inspection, she seemed to be tired and worried, with red cheeks and puffy eyes, sign she had been crying for a while recently. Iruka didn't need observation skills to be able to read such obvious signs, and knowing her 2 teammates were in the hospital, he was pretty sure that was the reason for her tears. "Sakura, what are you doing here? You should hurry home, your family will be worried," Iruka chided her, in his usual mother hen attitude he reserved for all his students, old and young alike. "Sorry, I went to see Ino and lost track of the time," she apologized, smiling sheepishly at him. Sakura then cleared her throat, looking down at the ground and then back up at her former teacher. "Say, Iruka-sensei, did you visit Naruto and Sasuke-kun?" The Chunin nodded, smiling warmly at her. "They are allowed to receive visits now, so you can go see them tomorrow if you want, alright?" Sakura nodded eagerly, then her expression turned conflicted. "Is there something you want to say?" he asked her gently, keeping his tone even and warm. "Iruka-sensei, she struggled with herself for a moment before staring into his eyes. "I made Naruto promise to bring Sasuke-kun back, and I was so cold and mean to him, but he said he'd do it without even protesting, and he did it. He kept his promise." And she looked down, her shoulders trembling. Iruka sighed. Naruto cares for you, Sakura." He placed one hand on her head, like he had done countless times when she had been younger. "Not just because he likes you, but because you are his teammate. Tomorrow I am sure you will find the right words for both him and Sasuke then. You know already what you want to say, right?" She nodded, taking a shuddery breath. "Then you will do well. Remember, being sorry means you are changing, and admitting you are wrong about something or someone is a good step ahead." He ruffled her hair slightly, then his tone turned mock serious. "Now you'd better run home, young miss. I can still scold you if you're late for supper." A small smile appeared on Sakura's face, and she nodded to herself. "Thank you, Haruka-sensei, you're the best." Still subdued, but looking more relieved than before, Sakura bowed and turned around, walking quickly until she was out of sight, and Haruka watched her go with a soft smile on his lips. Haruka did not move, though. He remained standing in the middle of the empty street for a long while, breathing the cool air and watching the shadows formed by the light of a lamppost curl around his feet until a darker silhouette appeared next to his own. Only then did he look up, facing the figure that was standing next to him in silence, almost waiting for him to speak. Haruka's face turned unnaturally blank. "What brings you here? Is everything okay?" he asked, turning away from the other man and apparently not at all bothered by its sudden appearance at his side. "Yes, I think everything is going rather well," the other replied with a shrug. "Are you sure it's a good idea in the first place?" Haruka's voice was filled with worry and uncertainty, but the other man leaned towards him and patted his back with familiarity. "I am aware of your bonds with him. You must agree with me that this is the best course of action after all. You have not complained about yourself, and you're coming back as well." Haruka let out a soft laugh, smiling as he stared up at the star-filled sky. His shoulders relaxed, and he found himself nodding in consent without even realizing it. "That's true, I guess. I don't mind coming back, after all, apart some gruesome parts, it was almost fun." "Almost." The figure chuckled under his breath. "Should I mention that time when?" Haruka shushed him. No need to remember that, waving one hand in front of his face to chase away a very embarrassing memory. Haruka fell quiet once more. The figure snickered softly, then tapped his shoulder. "Remember, we need to fix everything that is left over by tomorrow night, so be sure to report." Haruka waved his hand dismissively and nodded, but the figure was already gone. With a lingering smile on his lips, Haruka turned around and walked home. As he resurfaced from unconsciousness, Naruto was aware at first only of the strong, nauseating smell of antiseptic. It was so pungent that he wrinkled his nose, ripped away from sleep, and tried to unconsciously pull away from it, and the movement hurt. He blinked a few times, waiting for his blurry sight to focus on something, and he realized only after a while that he was facing a blank ceiling. The smell was still overpowering his senses, and he fought down the urge to retch. Naruto forced himself to take deep breaths, and after a while he was able to relax and ignore both the pain in his body and the smell. The room he was into had dim lights, which he was grateful for since his eyes hurt a bit. At the same time, he became aware of the silence surrounding him. Another good thing, his head was already hurting as it was, and noise would only make it worse. By the smell alone, his brain finally put one and one together. He was probably in Konoha's hospital, and by the way his body hurt with even the slightest movement, he could understand why he would be there. The sheets under his back were anything but soft though, and there was something under his lower back that was hard against his ribs, making him wince, so he decided to stop moving altogether and just wait for the pain to pass. Hesitantly turning his head to the left, he noticed he was inches away from the endless white that was the wall, so he turned to the right instead. Checking the rest of the room he was in, he cringed. There was another bed on the other side of the room, and inside it there was an equally heavily bandaged Sasuke, sleeping quietly. The sight managed to relieve him, and yet also made his chest hurt. His friend was safe and sound, but he was back only because Naruto had forced him to, through willpower and sheer determination, and he could see the results from his bed. Both of them were hurt. Thinking back at that moment in the Valley of End when they had faced each other, ready to go all the way, Naruto had to admit he had felt despair. He had truly believed his words would not reach Sasuke, that he was far too gone to see reason. He had been wrong. Sasuke had listened to him. In what Naruto could only describe as a miracle, he had gotten through Sasuke's thick head and got him to listen. He thanked every kami there was for this little miracle. Sasuke had accepted to come back. He would not leave again. Naruto had offered him a valid view thanks to his fists and will, and he guessed that was the best that he could do. Things were not completely solved, far from that, but they were going to be okay, at least for now. The door creaked open, attracting Naruto's attention from the sleeping figure of his friend. The nurse stepped into his room, glancing his way only for a second, before hurrying to Sasuke's bed to fuss around him for a little bit. She added a few flowers to the vase next to the bed, then rearranged his sheets without waking him, silent and competent. Naruto waited, not expecting her to offer any sort of assistance, especially now that he was awake, but he did not close his eyes, despite knowing what was going to happen. She looked at him only when there was nothing else to do for Sasuke, and even then it was with clear hesitation. She did not ask if he needed anything water, a pillow, and rather than full-on hatred she was looking disgusted, maybe afraid of him, which was somewhat stupid since he was stuck in a bed wrapped up like a mummy, but Naruto could not claim to understand what went through those adults' minds. It's the eyes, he idly thought, looking away. Their eyes were always what got to him the most. After so many years, he had grown apt to ignoring words of hate and whispered insults behind his back, but their eyes never hid their dislike. It was like what they couldn't voice was thrown to his face simply by looking at him. Naruto had learned that they were just ignorant. He was a vessel, not the demon, but how could they know? If even other shinobi mistakenly thought of him as the demon or as a controlled puppet in the hands of Kyuubi no Kitsune, how could civilians know better? That was why he endured even the glares. There was no point, not until he could find a way to let them all know who he was and what he could do. And there were already people who cared for him and showed that, and having that meant he did not care what a stupid nurse thought. He was not a monster, and yes, he wanted the villagers to stop glaring at him with hatred, but they would see it if they were given enough time. He would show them, and they would finally see him for who he was. Until then, he could tolerate the hatred because he had people who cared already. Ignoring the nurse's hesitance, he looked at Sasuke once again. Their fight had been more devastating than he'd ever thought possible, and they had both done their worst, so to speak. Naruto had been this close to dying, but for once things had gone the way they should have. Sasuke was back. It was perfectly justified, even if they had to stick to being in bed for a while. Unfortunately, that also meant Naruto had to accept other truths. He had called forth a power that was not his own in order to reach his friend, and that had been a powerful vacuum call. He was not a superhero. He was just a human who was willing to cross paths with a demon if it served him well. He was not above using underhanded means, exactly like Sasuke, even if it was for what he considered the greater good, and that made him feel weak. Naruto had spent most of his life creating childish delusions about himself, his past, the reasons why he was hated. It was a way like any other not to lose himself to despair, staying awake at night, cuddled in his bed, thinking up stories about who his parents were, why they were gone, why they had given him to the fourth to seal the beast inside him. If they were in the afterlife, regretful for their actions. He had clung to the hope that this was happening to him because he was special and that one day he would show it to everyone else. Naruto had a great determination and an even greater will, but this fight with Sasuke had shown him he was not as strong as he believed himself to be. He had fought hard against Sasuke, but that hadn't been a true victory. They had been tied up to the very end, and Sasuke had agreed to come back not because Naruto had won over him, but because he had managed to reach out and touch Sasuke's heart. He wasn't as superior as he believed himself to be. If he wanted to show the village his worth, he needed to gain that strength. He needed to find it with his own hands first. Naruto did not speak as the nurse finally advanced towards him, her eyes cool. It was her duty as a nurse to check up on him, so she could not deny him the same basic attentions as her other patients. She quickly checked his stats, made a show of fluffing up his pillow, then she glanced down at him. "Since you seem to be awake, I will have to warn you," she stated, voice steely. He looked at her. "I do not want to hear any sort of ruckus inside the room that could potentially disturb Uchiha-san. He needs rest, obviously, and while our Hokage seems to hold you in high regards, that is not a feeling shared by people more sensible to your treacherous deceits." Naruto rolled his eyes, snorting at her words. Yes, sure, he was deceiving the Hokage, just like he was the one who had corrupted their poor Sasuke-kun. He could just hear the nurses chide him for breathing, and part of him wished he was feeling better so that he could create some of this ruckus they seemed to be so afraid of. That would show them. He wanted to chuckle, but he didn't want to give the woman any leeway, so he refrained. The nurse seemed to notice how her words had not affected Naruto at all, because she huffed slightly. "It will be this lack of respect for your betters that will show you your place." Naruto had the perfect comeback on his lips, something along the lines of "Yeah, so I'll be sure to come here when I'm Hokage, just so you can congratulate me on what my place is," but someone else spoke up before he could. "I would suggest to mind your words. A disciplinary hearing would not benefit you, and receiving a note on your bad temper might prevent you from attaining that pair eyes you've been hoping for." The sudden intromission of a foreign voice jolted both the nurse and Naruto out of their staring. The injured teen did not know who had spoken up, but given his position and how he had a hard time even shifting, he could not sit up to see the newcomer, who was standing behind the nurse. Spluttering in embarrassment, the nurse spun around, moving away from Naruto's line of sight and allowing him to see the man standing there. He blinked in surprise, eyes growing wide as he noticed the mask covering the man's face. This guy was one of the village's Anbu guards, but Naruto was not fooled by his casual stance. He could feel a barely restrained aura of quiet disapproval surrounding him, and he felt an edge of wariness coil inside his stomach. The Anbu was strong, anybody could feel that, though how strong he did not know, and his whole aura spoke of danger, much like a creature waiting to pounce. The strokes of paint on his mask resembled a feline of sorts, crimson lines surrounding the eye holes in a way that made it seem even more feral, and Naruto shivered, as the Anbu was not looking at the nurse anymore, but at him. This was the feeling an Anbu offered, which was different from the cheerful appearance shinobi like Kakashi and Jiraiya had. The Anbu didn't need to hide behind a facade, he was all about intimidation and outspoken threat. Naruto couldn't help but peek at the man's attire in the few seconds between his appearance and the nurse freezing in place. The Anbu's vest was simple, just black and metal, but there was a sword draped on his back, tied in a black cloth, and there was a pouch to his waist and a smaller one tied to his left leg. He looked ready for a mission, and Naruto felt a wave of awe and respect for a man ready for everything even in his own village. Unsure how to react to the Anbu's appearance, Naruto remained quiet, waiting for the man to stop staring at him, or at least to speak up. Part of him was wary this was one of Konoha's best shinobi, what was he doing in the hospital, in his room? And another part was feeling a strong wave of awe. He had never been able to see Anbu this close, not even during Oto's attack, so this was a novelty. The nurse let out a strangled yelp, then forgetting protocol, she turned around and left the room in a hurry, not even looking back, the door slamming behind her back. Naruto only felt relieved for a split second, because when he looked at the Anbu again, the man was still staring at him, putting him on edge. After what felt like an eternity, the Anbu finally looked away, and Naruto relaxed a bit, watching the man look toward Sasuke's bed. The other teen was still sleeping, completely unaware of what was going on around him. But the man's aura diminishing now that the nurse was gone, Naruto could barely feel a chakra pulse coming from the Anbu, which was a statement of his strength. He watched as the guy moved towards his teammate's bed, slowly and without making any noise. Curious about what the older shinobi was going to do, Naruto simply stared. The Anbu wasn't doing anything, actually, he was simply staring at Sasuke like he had stared at Naruto, without moving. Naruto took a deep sigh. The Anbu was probably there under Tsunade's orders to check on Sasuke, or maybe the council had ordered him to protect their precious Uchiha heir, who knew? As long as they were aware Sasuke would not run away anymore, then it was fine. Maybe it was simply because he still had some sort of resentment toward Sasuke, or better, for the way people treated him, but he had to wonder what was so interesting about Sasuke that made everybody want to love him so much. Yeah, he was the last of the infamous Uchiha clan, but that to Naruto meant nothing. The clan was gone, and it seemed stupid to him that the value of a person had to be influenced by the family, rather than by personal accomplishments. Besides, Naruto could say he knew Sasuke better than anybody else, because they were teammates and tentatively, even friends. He knew what Sasuke thought of this worshipping thing the village reserved him. It had taken a lot of fighting involved, but once he had goaded him enough, Sasuke had been willing to talk, if only to vent. Naruto now could say he understood Sasuke a little more, and even if there was still some discomfort about the way everybody kept Sasuke on a pedestal, Naruto had learned that being worshipped like that didn't really make Sasuke any happier, and if anything, the two of them were equally messed up in different ways. The Anbu only glanced up once, surprising Naruto who quickly looked away and then returned to stare at Sasuke. Naruto took a deep breath and tried to relax on the bed. Receiving attention like this from such a shinobi made him anxious, and he wasn't sure this was good. He was unable to really rest with the man still in the room, but the silence wasn't unwelcome. If Sasuke was going to receive visits, things would not remain quiet for long. It is very pathetic, the Anbu finally spoke, voice soft but steely. Naruto looked at him again, straining his neck a bit. He wondered if the man was talking about him or the situation, or has no one realized the foolishness that this boy has fallen into? The Anbu continued, making his way back towards Naruto's bed. Once there, he knelt down until he was the same eye level with the teen. This close, Naruto was finally able to see the mask for what it was and recognize the animal it represented. It was a panther. You did, though, did you? The Anbu's voice snapped Naruto out of his stupor again. And yet you chased him, and you did not stop until you had him back in Konoha. Naruto was taken aback by the fact that the cold tone of the man's voice had disappeared now that he was talking to him, replaced with something else. Not quite warmth, but definitely nothing mean. The Anbu was speaking to him without hatred. Then, the words registered into Naruto's mind, and he blinked. Foolishness. Yes, Sasuke had been foolish. He had tried to leave Konoha following the wrong lead, seeking the wrong kind of power. It was surprising someone who wasn't one of Naruto's important people agreed with him about it, though. Can you sit up? Not allowing Naruto time to ponder over what he had said, the man waited expectantly for his answer, still kneeling next to the bed. The tone was still calm, void of anger, and Naruto wondered if he was being lulled into a false sense of security, or if he could actually relax. This man was an Anbu, and if he had wanted to hurt him, he could have done so without even trying. Naruto was tired and injured, after all, but he seemed calm and not threatening anymore despite being still imposing. The teen cleared his throat, feeling as if any kind of verbal reply would crush and destroy this strange sort of friendliness the man was showing him, and attempted to push himself up to a sitting position. His body felt heavy and tired and achy, but he managed to get himself halfway up before his head started to spin, turning the edges of his vision black. He groaned softly and stopped, ready to lower himself back on the mattress, but without warning a hand secured itself around his back, aiding him up until he was sitting on the bed, his pillow comfortably cushioning him from the cold wall. The position felt good, he could breathe better and it didn't hurt, so he graced the man with a grateful smile. The comforting hand on his shoulder moved away, but the Anbu did not stand up from his kneeling position. If Naruto didn't know any better, he could have thought the older shinobi was concerned about him, which was nice but improbable. "Are you feeling better now?" the Anbu asked him, the sound of his voice vaguely soothing. Naruto nodded, grinning sheepishly. The Anbu's eyes moved down his frame, observing the bandages, then hissed in displeasure as he noticed that one of Naruto's wounds on his back had reopened, soaking them with blood. Naruto looked down, wincing, then shrugged. He was aware that he wasn't in a good shape, but his wounds would close themselves up pretty quickly, and he did not want to be subjected to more glares from the nurses because he was asking for a change of bandages. Maybe he'd just wait for Iruka to come and help. Instead he was about to tell the Anbu he would get that fixed soon, but then noticed how his hands were clenched into fists. If he hadn't been wearing gloves, Naruto was sure the knuckles would be white. Was he angry? Was it because of the wound or, honestly, he had just met the man? He couldn't be angry on his behalf, but maybe Anbu were more neutral than he had thought, and they considered him just like any other shinobi, rather than the Kyuubi container. That would be a pleasant change. Uzumaki Naruto, the Anbu finally stood up and looked down at him. Naruto gulped uneasily at his tone. "My name is Hidoku, and I am the commander of the Anbu troops." This wasn't entirely a surprise for Naruto. The man was oozing power, and he would have been a fool not to notice it. Still, this man was the commander of the Anbu. He had heard so many stories in regards to this person. All shinobi from Konoha knew of this name, and the amount of things Naruto heard even at Ichiraku Ramen, when older Jounin teamed together for a meal, was astonishing. Naruto had always looked up to strong ninja like Jiraiya or Kakashi, but there was indeed a good deal of all left for the many tales surrounding this Anbu commander. And now he was standing there in his hospital room, and Naruto felt a jolt of smugness at the thought that he was the one awake to talk to him, and Sasuke was still asleep. "Take that, Sasuke." He couldn't wait to tell Shikamaru that he'd met the Anbu commander. His next words came as a complete shock. "I am offering you a chance to join the Anbu ranks." Naruto's brain stuttered to a sudden halt. "What?" He looked up at the blank mask, asking for confirmation, but the eyes peeking from behind were serious and dark. "Wait, what?" Iruka was, unfortunately, not a morning person. Being a teacher also meant he had to wake up early if he wanted to get to the academy in time to get things ready for his students, and today was no exception. The dreaded practice day with weaponry was waiting for him at the academy, and he had yet to wake up properly. His thoughts on the cup of coffee he would get once he got there. Iruka walked down the streets of Konoha, stretching his sleepy muscles slowly. He really wasn't looking forwards to his kids handling a bunch of shuriken. Konohamaru wouldn't be much trouble. The kid usually trained by himself during his free time, together with Mogi and Yuden, and even if his aim wasn't the best, at least he had some prior practice that could help. But the rest of the class was comprised mostly by civilian kids, learning how to be a ninja, and most of them had no knowledge whatsoever. It was not a happy prospect. "Iruka-sensei." Iruka inwardly cringed as he heard Sakura's voice. She was exuberant from the early morning without fail, and while she had been one of his best students at the academy, sometimes he still thought she was far too cheerful so early on. He stopped and waited for her, rubbing his temple and pasting a smile on his lips. "Sakura, it is pretty early," he greeted her. "Did you sleep last night?" She seemed fine, with no trace of the tears and red eyes from the night before, so he guessed that she was motivated and ready to tackle things with her teammates, which was good for her. Iruka was proud she was taking the initiative. "Don't worry for me, sensei," she told him mock serious, then smiled. "I had a good night's sleep but was feeling too antsy to wait any longer, so I thought I could go see Naruto and Sasuke now, but sensei, are you okay? You look tired." Iruka smiled at her, amused at her worry. "Don't worry, it's just that today is target practice day, and well, you do remember what happened when you were my student, do you?" Sakura flushed crimson and suddenly seemed to find her feet more interesting, shuffling awkwardly at the embarrassing memories of her own first target practice. Let's not dwell on such old memories, right? Iruka-sensei. She cleared her throat. "I have become good with shuriken now." "Yeah, I am sure you have," he replied with a proud smile, and she peered up at him, grinning sheepishly. "But the hospital is the opposite way, so why are you here?" Sakura's face turned annoyed. "I met Kakashi-sensei on the way there, he sent me on an errand for him here, he said to give you this." Sakura handed him a small package she'd been holding until then, and Iruka took it with a confused frown, wondering about its contents. Ada Kakashi and himself were not really on friendly terms as they only ever spoke in regards to Naruto's welfare, and Iruka was still a bit annoyed at the man's uncaring attitude in general, so he was definitely curious and wary about what the package was all about. "Thank you, Sakura," he smiled at her. "I have to hurry now or I will, how dreadful, miss practice day," Sakura giggled. "Will you tell Naruto that I will be there once I'm out from work?" "Of course, sensei." Sakura saluted him and hurried away, and he was left staring at her retreating back for the second time in 2 days. Sakura was a nice girl, especially when she tried to fix things on her own, so he hoped her visit would at least mend things between TAM7. He examined the package with perplexity, and as he did so he noticed with the corner of his eye a figure flickering past the rooftop of a house at his right. With a shrug, he put the mystery package under his arm and resumed his walk towards the academy. He guessed he would have to try and open it during his lunch break unless something bad happened during practice and he had to forego his lunch to tend to his students. It wouldn't be the first time this happened, after all, and he could go holding his curiosity for a bit longer. All the while, he was aware of a pair of eyes following him from the roofs. His morning stretched on slowly, but Iruka was used to the pace and in the past years had learned to enjoy it. It was a privilege of the teacher to unnerve students, keep them on their toes, and popping unexpected quiz questions on them when they didn't listen. It was a part of Iruka that would never be fully forgotten. He was a prankster, always had been, and while he had been forced to grow up and mature too quickly, that part had grown with him. But the death of his parents, Iruka had to take care of himself and sought attention in the same way Naruto had done, which was what had brought the two of them together in the end. The desperate need to mess with people was still alive within it, and he felt absolutely no shame in keeping on edge his students. After all, no teacher could be strict all the time without coming to care and think about his students, and this way Iruka kept a balanced mix of respect and fear from them. Under the thick layers of responsible acting and strict rules, his mischievous self still demanded some sacrifices. Small things, throwing chalk at them when they didn't pay attention, using his roaring voice to scold them with those he showed who was in control of the class, and gained their respect back when he pulled similar jokes on his fellow teachers, especially those who were less talented at dealing with the kids. Being a good teacher had its perks. Unfortunately, he was the one not quite as attentive as he should, as he was still thinking about Naruto, even while teaching class. Not even that dreaded shuriken practice he had been preparing for throughout the last few weeks could distract him, nor lift his spirits, even though it did help him focus more. He had to, especially when one of his young girls almost successfully managed to chop his head off with a shuriken she was supposed to throw in the opposite direction. Kids these days, Iruka-sensei. Iruka was startled out of his thoughts by a chorus of 3 voices, and he looked down already knowing who they belonged to: Konohamaru, Mogi and Yuden. The sight of the goggles on each of the 3 students' foreheads always managed to bring a smile out of Iruka, who knew who they were trying to imitate by using them. Of all the people who believed in Naruto, those 3 were by far the most sincere ones. "Konohamaru, go back to your practice," Iruka told him sternly, his eyes promising one hell of a pain if he were not to follow his order. Konohamaru yelped and backed away, but then swallowed down his fears and grabbed the Chunin's arm, looking up at him pleadingly. "Iruka-sensei, please. I just want to know if we can go see Naruto Nai-chan today." Iruka's eyes softened a bit, but just a bit. "Focus on your throwing practice, Konohamaru, or you will never get out of the academy," he stated, watching the kid's face fall. He smiled. "Nothing stops you from going to see Naruto in the hospital this afternoon, though." All 3 kids smiled brightly at him and ran back to their training, clearly happier now as they chatted about what they could bring to their boss as a get-well gift. Iruka's smile lingered, even if briefly, before he yelled out his encouraging orders at all the kids. In a world that was dangerous and implied that a lot of the same kids he was teaching would not last more than a decade, just knowing they had such a fire burning within them made him feel like he was not wasting his life teaching them the way of the ninja. He really did love to be a teacher. Naruto stared at the white wall without really seeing it. He had been staring at it for a while already, almost like it held all the answers to the questions of the universe, and unfortunately he wasn't nowhere close to understanding them. The fact was, nothing made sense and he just couldn't get it. Things like that happened to other people, definitely not to the likes of him. It was like something out of a book or one of the movies he liked when he was little, where the normal hero was given the chance to be something more, something better, and he showed it to everybody. Only that this time it had happened to him, not to someone else, not to Sasuke. He really did not know what to think about the offer he'd received. It still felt like a dream. An Anbu, a freaking Anbu, and not just a random one, but Venom Panther, the commander of the troops, had offered him a place in their ranks. He had offered a chance to him. To him, to Naruto. Someone had looked at him, not at Sasuke, and had seen enough potential to want to invest on it. Someone had chosen him instead of other people who were probably more skilled or worth it: Neji, who was the strongest genin of the past 2 years, or Shikamaru, who was the smartest ever, or Sasuke, who had so much to offer. I am offering you a chance to join the Anbu ranks, Hayu had said. Anbu? He had never even thought about an Anbu career, his attention solely focused on the Hokage position, but they had always looked so cool to him, so strong with their masks, their enormous power, moving through the night like shadows. He remembered Haku dressed as one, with his imposing mask, on his very first real mission, where Naruto had met with death in its impassive horrid beauty, and how he'd felt inferior to him. Haku had been an enemy, but he had been strong, and so very cool, and Naruto could look back and admit he'd been just an untrained, embarrassing child. He hoped he had managed to get better since then. He could understand Haku better now, his reasons, his words from back then. He could see his own stupidity now, the mask that he'd placed over his real self in order to protect his fragile illusions. He had wanted recognition so badly, nothing else had ever mattered. What about now? Someone was giving him the attention he had craved. To him, and only him. Anbu? Naruto's voice had trembled, hesitation clear, but the man had not reacted badly to his confusion, and Naruto could have sworn he had been amiably smiling under the panther mask. I am offering this opportunity to you, Naruto, and to you alone. Obviously not to the Uchiha. Just to you. Because I can see what you can become, given some time. Anbu would accept you with open arms, were you to choose that path to follow. This is where you could belong, and where you could get the training you need to show your true skills. A real training, a place where people could accept him. Naruto had wanted something like this for all his life, and now that it was being offered to him, he couldn't help but be hesitant. It was just too good. Did a place that could accept him without him having to prove himself really exist? Just like that. Was that man just fooling around with him? Was he speaking the truth? Naruto wasn't as disillusioned as he had once been. He knew that to gain what he wanted, to be acknowledged, he had to make sacrifices, fight his way through with teeth and claws. Was the offer all there was to it, or was it not? Part of him wanted to believe the Anbu and trust him, but he had decided that only trusting his heart would not work that well. He had trusted Sasuke and had to chase him all the way to the Valley of End to fight against him, all of that just to get him to listen. Not his smartest moment. Then Naruto. Blinking and resurfacing from his confused thoughts, the teen realized that Sasuke had woken up and was staring at him from the other end of the room. Sasuke's voice was unexpectedly hesitant, a trait that one would not associate with him, honestly, but Naruto understood he also did not know how to act around him, not after what had happened at the Valley of End. They looked at each other for a moment, both stuck with feeling somewhat awkward and more than a bit embarrassed. It wasn't about forgiveness. Naruto had already forgiven Sasuke, and Sasuke, knowing he had been wrong, had forgiven Naruto for butting in. No, it was about their friendship and the fact that they were teammates, and more than that, it was because they had been more open with each other than they had been with anybody in a long time, and that messed up the way they acted around each other. When you confide in someone for the first time, there's always a moment where you have to find the rhythm again, and Naruto and Sasuke were going through exactly that. Then the moment passed, and both Naruto and Sasuke felt the air shift around them. They would be okay. Sasuke stretched his arms slowly, then cracked his neck. This hospital thing is boring, he stated, then after a moment of hesitation, he added, how are you, dope? The voice was teasing, with no trace of the previous harshness. Better than you I think, team, Naruto shot back, smirking. You look like a mummy. Sasuke snorted softly, then raised one eyebrow, as Naruto was just as covered in bandages as he was. Naruto chuckled sheepishly. Silence fell on them again, but it wasn't as tense as it could have been, which was as good as it could be, everything considered. Naruto idly watched dust flutter in front of him, then sighed. I hope someone brings some food sometime soon, I'm starving. I'd eat 3 ramen cups, maybe even 4. Sasuke's lips twitched upwards. The door chose that moment to crack open, as if to answer Naruto's words, and Sakura stomped in, looking determined but cheerful. She had been standing outside of their room for a while, not that they could have known, simply psyching herself up for the confrontation. There had been many things to think about while Naruto and Sasuke had been unconscious in the hospital, and a lot of it had to do with herself. The sense of abandonment she had felt when Sasuke had left, the helplessness of having been unable to help him, and the reassurance Naruto had offered her, despite the way she had treated him before. Sakura had thought a lot about things. While the crush she had on Sasuke was still there, she could finally look at it with more rationality, and she felt disappointed in herself for acting like a weak fangirl, rather than the Kunoichi she was. And her dislike for Naruto, it had all stemmed from so many places that to try and find when it had started would take far too long. But she did not hate Naruto anymore. If she had to be honest with herself, he had been a bit annoying with his crush on her, but at the same time he had never pushed anything on her and had always tried to be open and include her in things, even when he and Sasuke kept spurring each other on. Naruto had been a friend to her, but she had not accepted that, nor the fact that they were teammates. And with Sasuke, she had seen him as her crush first, rather than a person and a teammate. But both she had failed to grasp the real meaning of being in a team, and while she could not make her crush on Sasuke vanish just like that, she was going to act like a more mature person and work with both of them to restore their friendship instead. She was a Kunoichi. She had chosen this path despite her parents' attempts to dissuade her because she knew she wanted to be one. This was supposed to be something Sakura had decided for herself, on her own, not because of some boy or to seem more interesting, and it was time she remembered this. Just like Naruto, who had never betrayed his word, now Sakura would do the same. She had promised herself she would be a better friend and teammate, and most of all, a better ninja. If she'd been a friend, instead of a pathetic girl with a crush, maybe she could have understood both her teammates, instead of watching them break apart. But no more. Good morning. She tried to sound cheerful as she walked into the room, closing the door behind her back. For once, her priority was Naruto, and that was refreshing, in a way. Sakura-chan. Naruto's eyes filled with warmth and happiness, and Sakura felt another pang of guilt. Yes, things had to change. Apparently feeling that Sakura was up to something, grunted and looked out of the window, faking disinterest for his teammates' interaction. Sakura moved to Naruto's bed, and she hesitated only a fraction before she punched the teen lightly on the head. Ouch. Naruto winced, not sure what to expect, but when he looked at Sakura again, he saw her holding something out to him. What's in there? Ramen, of course, she made a show of rolling her eyes. I thought you would be famished and hospital food doesn't cut it now, does it? She smiled a bit, then turned serious and swallowed thickly on the lump in her throat. Just consider this a thank you. I haven't been the best of friends until now, but I will do better, Naruto. Please accept my apologies for asking you to do something for me that I had no rights of asking you, and for treating you like I was above you. Naruto grabbed the offered bag with a bright smile and nudged Sakura's hand with his own. Well, I always say everybody deserves a second chance, he rubbed the bridge of his nose, embarrassed by her words. We can start again, that would be nice. He knew what she meant and that she was saying she was sorry, and he gladly accepted her, because this was Sakura-chan, and he cared for her a lot, and having her say they were friends was way better than the way she had acted earlier on. She had been his very first crush, and even though he still liked her a lot, it didn't feel like the kind of like he wanted. Sakura preferred Sasuke, and he could not compete with that. He wouldn't compete. Not because he was inferior to Sasuke, but because he wished for a kind of love that would be for him first and foremost, not a second best. And respecting Sakura's own feelings was the right thing to do. Maybe in the future, she might come to see him like that, but that was not now, and Naruto did not want to keep his hopes up indefinitely just because there might be an opening in a far future. Besides, by renouncing to this one-sided love, he was opening himself up to something far more important, a friendship. To break the silence, he ripped the bag open and took out one of 3 freshly made, still steaming takeaway cups of ramen, directly from his favorite stand. Thank you, Sakura-chan. Ah, Ichiraku ramen is the best. Naruto did the only sensible thing he could and started to inhale his food, allowing Sakura to move from his side to Sasuke's. Seeing them talk was a bit bitter, but at the same time he was aware that Sasuke's first thought was not girls, and he had never shown any sort of interest in Sakura, so that made her feelings for him just as one-sided as Naruto's own for her. Sakura smiled, grateful that Naruto had managed to understand without so many words, then looked over to where Sasuke was and walked to him. There was something she had to say, and acting straightforwardly would be the only way. She opened her mouth, and in that instant, looking at Sasuke's face, she knew exactly what the answer would be. She had always known, but the knowledge now surprisingly didn't hurt as much as she thought it would. She bit her lower lip and steadied herself for rejection. Sasuke-kun, I like you, she stated, clear and unashamed, with just a soft dusting of red on her cheeks. Things would be somewhat awkward, but they would get better. Giving up on Sasuke, knowing she had never had a chance with him from the very start, was the only thing she could offer in exchange for Naruto's friendship. And Sasuke's too. The slurping sound from Naruto's side of the room ceased for a moment, but then started again, and Sakura tried to calm her pounding heart. Sasuke seemed to consider her words carefully, and she was grateful for that. It seemed that being direct gave her a better response from him than acting like a little kid. I do not like you, Sakura, he replied, looking right at her, voice steady and even. There was no pity in his tone, nor dislike, but also there was no opening for hope either. He was responding to her direct approach by being honest and clear, so she would not get her hopes up in vain. Sakura nodded, her lower lip trembling just the slightest bit. No chance that you might change idea? She asked then, and her voice was strangely steady. Still looking right into her eyes, Sasuke shook his head. No, I don't think so, he replied. Then, in a show of goodwill, he decided to continue. You're aware of what my goals are, Sakura. Right now, there is no place for anything else in my life, I hope you can respect that. Sakura had always thought that if she ever was rejected by her love, she'd feel like the world had crumbled on her. She thought that it would hurt so much, and that was why she had never openly confessed, putting her feelings down in front of him. She had been hiding behind her attraction to Sasuke, afraid that he would do just that, reject her. Strangely, it didn't feel like that at all. Her heart missed a beat, yes, but it didn't stop all of a sudden. The world didn't end. It was just the end of her crush. Then can we be friends? She asked, breathing deeply. Sasuke stared at her, inwardly surprised that she was willing to put aside a crush, at least in theory, but positively impressed that with how much shit this team had gone through, they had only ended up being closer. He nodded. Yeah, he murmured, looking out of the window. Sure. Sakura smiled, reassured by his calm acceptance, and from the other end of the room, Naruto also felt his lips twitch into a smile as he slurped down a mouthful of noodles. This sounded like a turning point for TAM7. Bam. The door slammed open without warning, banging loudly against the wall as a man entered the room like a living tornado, effectively breaking the contemplative, thoughtful mood that had settled on the three. Jiraiya straightened his back, puffing his chest out with an aura of importance and self-esteem, bouncing towards Naruto's bed with an overly stretched smile on his lips, completely ignoring the two teens on the other side of the room. He always knew how to make an entrance. Suffocating on a mouthful of ramen, Naruto started coughing loudly, staring in surprise at his mentor, the situation between Sasuke and Sakura momentarily forgotten. I, Jiraiya the Toad Sennin, have arrived. The Sennin smirked proudly. Silence greeted him, and the man turned around to look at the other two teens in the room before looking back down at Naruto. All three members of TAM7 were staring at him with a weird look in their eyes. Coughing discreetly, Jiraiya shrugged it off like he did every time he announced himself, and his mood shifted abruptly to a serious one, observing the young teen on the bed with concern. Flopping down on the chair next to his pupil's bed, he asked, "How are you feeling, Naruto?" Sasuke, Sakura, and Ramen forgotten in a second, Naruto smiled one of his rare, real smiles at the Sennin, the kind of calm, meaningful grin he only reserved to the people he considered closest to him. "I'm fine, Iro Sennin," he replied, more to reassure the man than anything else. In a way, both of them knew Jiraiya needed to hear this from him. "How many times did I tell you I don't want you to call me that, you brat?" The man growled, though there was a small smile on his lips. Naruto chuckled, he knew Jiraiya was strong, but that didn't mean he was not a pervert. Thus he would never stop calling him like that. Besides, both knew it was more an endearment than anything else. "Well, let's cut the chase," Jiraiya puffed his chest out, tapping it with one hand. "I have come here with an offer. You are hereby allowed to follow the greatest ninja walking on the elemental countries for training, which is to say, me." He couldn't have looked more pompous if he had tried. "I want you to join me for my next trip outside of Konoha, Naruto. You will train under my tutelage for the next 3 years, becoming the new pupil of the Hermit Toad Sennin." For the second time in less than 2 hours, Naruto was left speechless. What? The hospital room was silent. Naruto was left alone with his thoughts again, which were now even messier than before, so he did need some time to sort through them. Sakura had gone home, humbled by finding out that the perverted old man who had offered training to Naruto was actually one of the strongest ninja from Konoha, and Sasuke had been taken away for questioning. After all, even if Naruto had vouched for him and Tsunade trusted him, that did not mean she trusted Sasuke, not to mention an attempt at betraying the village was no easy feat and she needed to act accordingly to the gravity of the matter. That left Naruto alone enough for him to think things through. Jiraiya had offered to train him. He had said that in front of his teammates, and that said volumes of the man's intentions. Before, he had grumbled even just at the thought of helping Naruto learn a jutsu, and now he was offering him not just a few hours of training, but full apprenticeship. 3 years. Then they would be away from Konoha. Naruto supposed it was a good thing. It meant he would get to be trained by an awesome shinobi, one of the best even if he was a pervert. It was a chance neither Sasuke nor Sakura could have. He should have been bouncing in happiness, and yet he wasn't as excited at the news as he thought he would be. He had opened his mouth to reply, but nothing had come out and he had fallen silent, eyes wide in surprise, knowing that his silence had worried his teammates and also Jiraiya. Was it so wrong he had faltered rather than answer a resounding yes? The look of hurt in Jiraiya's eyes at his lack of an answer had made Naruto feel massively guilty. The man had offered him training, an apprenticeship, and Naruto hadn't refused, yes, but he hadn't jumped at the chance either. Naruto clenched his hand into a fist, glaring down at it with a frown. He wanted to agree, but then the Anbu's words had superimposed on Jiraiya's offer, and that had stopped him. All excitement had vanished from him, and he'd been left with nothing but confusion and longing. "I have to think about it," he had muttered instead, surprising the Sennin, Sasuke and even Sakura, who had been staring at him with worry. Naruto chuckled bitterly, looking down at the pendant he wore around his neck. The necklace Tsunade had given him glinted softly when it caught a stray ray of light. He was confused. He didn't know what to do. Where was his determination now? Why did he even want to consider becoming an Anbu? Maybe because Hayu had spoken to him seriously, confidentially, openly. Maybe because he was more tired than he could admit even to himself. Did he really want to move down that path? As an Anbu? Do I really know what it means to be an Anbu? He wondered, closing his eyes. Have a secret life, of which I cannot speak with anyone. Something private, sacred, but he already had a secret he could not reveal, even though the burden was sometimes enough to make him cringe. And then, he'd have to kill if things came down to that. Right. Anbu were supposed to know how to kill. It's one thing to declare to be a ninja, say you can kill and delude yourself you can, and another is to actually do it and accept what you've done. He was not sure who'd said that. He supposed it could have been Naruto or maybe another one of the academy teachers, but the words had burned themselves in his mind and now resurfaced with even greater clarity. If given no other choice, Naruto had always reassured himself that in order to protect his precious people he would kill. It had never happened not yet, but would he really be able to live with that burden? Besides, what if killing came as a mission requirement and not to protect someone he cared for? What if it was just to protect himself or the mission? Or just because it was an enemy that had to die? He'd always tried not to think about it, but he couldn't run away from the thought anymore, now. It was important. Am I really that good of a ninja? Naruto looked out of the window, following a butterfly fly by until the animal disappeared behind the corner. Unbidden, a memory of Saratobi's face slowly resurfaced from the depths of his mind. The Sandaime had visited the academy to make a speech to Naruto's class, but the kids, most of them at least, were not paying attention. Naruto had been doodling on his desk, but then something in the Hokage's tone had attracted his attention. You might be far too young to understand my words, for now, the man had said, smiling gently. Being a shinobi means you might have to make a decision between your life and the life of someone else. Facing dangers, missions where it's either your life or that of your enemy. The enemy of one day might then become the ally of another. The balance between an assassin and ninja is determined by that person's heart, will and strength, and how far he is willing to go in order to protect what's important for him. Back then, Naruto had only been thinking about the excitement that being a ninja would bring to him. He'd been more focused on the dangers and missions than on the it's your life or that of your enemy. He had ignored the seriousness of the Hokage's words. Now things had changed. He could understand what the man had meant. Then what? Anbu or 3 years with Jiraiya? Was that his choice? What would change in his life if he chose one path instead of the other? Closing his eyes, Naruto let himself fall back on the mattress, not even wincing as the pain was almost completely gone already. This decision would prove to be rather complicated, after all. He didn't answer, Tsunade. Jiraiya refused to look at the Hokage. Hands clenched into fists at his sides, head lowered so Tsunade couldn't see his conflicted expression. Jiraiya was trying to hide his hurt and his anger from his former teammate. His eyes were obviously bright at the prospect of coming with me, he spit out after a short moment of silence, his frown so deep it showed more than a couple new wrinkles. But then he stopped. I know he was about to accept, Tsunade. And then he didn't. Just like that, he calmed down, hesitated, then he said he needed time to think about it. If he had to be honest with himself, something that came hard to him, Jiraiya would admit he was not jealous, nor angry. Well, no, that wasn't true. He was angry, just a little bit. He should have known better than to feel betrayed by the fact that Naruto had failed to act like he had predicted he would. No, that was normal. Naruto was a teenager, and they were unpredictable. No. He was angry simply because of that one look Naruto had given him, before mentioning he needed time. He had looked confused. Uncertain. Yes, maybe the man would have preferred to have a joyous, spontaneous reaction that could reassure him about just how much Naruto wanted to be his apprentice, but if Naruto, of all people, was thinking about things instead of rushing through them with haste, then it meant there were serious issues that needed to be faced. And Jiraiya did not like that even someone like Naruto had seen it, but he, the great Sennin, had once again failed to face them. Tsunade looked down at her hands, not knowing what to say. She had not expected Naruto's blatant lack of reaction either, and she could understand Jiraiya's pain, but her gut feeling gnawing at her kept telling her about a different reason for his hesitance, one she was afraid to contemplate. Sounding desperate, Jiraiya turned around. Naruto needs this. Not just for his own protection, but to learn things he wouldn't if he remained in the village, Tsunade. I could see the hesitation in his eyes, and yet, don't you think I know, Jiraiya? She snapped at him, not liking his tone. It was too bad, really, that more than Jiraiya's thoughts on the matter, she was thinking at Hyu's words. She did not like it, but maybe they held some truth. Naruto did need a break, a place safe away from the village where he could learn how to harness his skills without having to worry about anything, but maybe that did not mean leaving the village to go on a journey was the right way. A part of her cringed at thinking that, but it made her feel somewhat better. That did not mean she wanted him to have a go at the Anbu either. Unfortunately she could not ask someone like Jiraiya to stay in Konoha just to help Naruto, as he had his own job that he was needed to do. But she had to ask. Jiraiya, she looked up at him abruptly, brown eyes serious, willing him to understand. If he were to accept Hayu's offer, would you be willing to stay here to help?" The Senin froze. Tsunade knew she was asking him too much. Not just because of his information network, which he kept running from his various bases around the lands, but also because, well, she knew he wanted to leave still. The man knew, deep down, that running didn't accomplish anything, and yet he was too used to running away, so even small little steps were met with stubborn reluctance. Naruto had helped with this, but Tsunade was not sure that would be enough. Tsunade had to wonder if Jiraiya was trying to get Naruto to follow him in the vain attempt to see if the teen was really like him, but he wasn't. Tsunade knew this. Naruto was not Jiraiya, just like he was not Tsunade either. And despite all the resemblances with his parents, with how brash and lively he was, just like Kushina, and the twinkle of his father's genius echoing in his eyes, Naruto was not them either. He was growing to be his own person, and they had to accept it. "Don't tell me you agree with the Anbu now." Jiraiya snarled, hiding his growing distress under a blanket of rage. She shook his head. "Kami knows I don't want him to. But if that's what he chooses, then I won't stop him. It's his life, Jiraiya, he will need to make his own decisions, make his own mistakes." She halted, then, softly, she added, "It won't do for him to repeat ours." Jiraiya accused a blow, leaning on the wall for support and refusing to look at her. He opened his mouth twice to speak again, to defend himself, to negate what Tsunade was implying, but found no energy to do so. She was right. He could not protect Naruto forever, especially if the way he was trying to protect him was by making him act like himself. "He's going to be released from the hospital in a few hours," Tsunade said after a long pause, not looking up from her desk. "Kyuubi's healing power kicked in earlier today, and his wounds are completely healed already. Maybe he'd like to see you again." Jiraiya straightened up, hesitating. "No. I will give him time to decide for himself which offer to take. It wouldn't do to mess with the kid's mind more." The two Sannin finally looked up and their gazes met. They suddenly felt really, really old. Leaving the hospital put Naruto in a very good mood. Being idle for too long was not really his thing, and he missed running around and training already, so as he stepped out from the hospital front doors, he had plans for the day already. "Boy Naruto." Looking up, Naruto found 3 of his friends waiting for him outside, and he smiled brightly at them. It looked like they were fine despite their own fights, and that made his worry lessen. Neji had arrived at the hospital depleted of chakra and with all Tenketsu points almost completely exhausted, but after some intensive care he looked just fine. He was going to have to rest for a while still, but the medic Nin had done wonders for him. Shikamaru was the one who had been physically hurt the least and only had a couple bandages on his arms, but he looked pensive and serious, and his mood made Naruto worry for him instantly. The lazy butt was clearly bothered by something, but knowing him he would not share his worries until he had come up with a proper explanation, which made Naruto tense up a bit. Last but not least, there was Kiba, leaning against the wall of the hospital and looking almost naked without his usual hood and Akamaru on his shoulder. The dog had been left at home with Kiba's older sister Hana, forced to rest after his battle. Kiba looked a bit battered still, but he was smirking, which Naruto took to mean he was feeling better. The sight filled Naruto with relief, as it had been his fault his friends had been hurt. As he approached them, the 3 stared at him, almost as if appraising his health, and when they decided he didn't have any lasting damage that they could see, they all relaxed, and even Shikamaru's frown smoothed out. "Nice to see you out of that stinking place, Naruto." Kiba patted his back in a show of camaraderie. "Is everything okay?" "Oh, is the prick still in the hospital?" Naruto smirked and pushed a thumb to his chest. "I'm always fine, Kiba. Nothing can keep me down, I'm a fast healer." "And yeah, he's still recovering." He paused, then glanced at the 3. "Are you sure you're okay?" Kiba shrugged, pointing at himself as if that was enough of an answer. He had been deathly worried for his friends and Akamaru back at home, but seeing Naruto this boisterous and smiling, put his worries to rest. Neji offered him a smile. It was still somewhat awkward to push aside his usual cold attitude, but he had to admit that having friends to worry about made it a bit easier. He hadn't felt at peace for a long time, but lately he had started to think that things were definitely getting better. He had emerged victorious from his brutal fight with a burning desire to not just grow stronger, but also learn more about himself and his own goals. He was glad that his companions were also fine and that the frail friendship he'd formed with them was allowed to grow. Shikamaru observed Kiba and Naruto's idle chat, scratching his head and keeping quiet. His shoulders were heavy with guilt, coming back almost unscathed from their mission, only to see his friends all hurt, but seeing as they had succeeded, he was grateful. He did not know what could have happened if the rescue mission had failed, but thankfully he would never know. They had not failed. Sasuke had been taken back and Naruto was still smiling. Shikamaru thought back at what his sensei had said that this would be a lesson for him, to learn from what he perceived as mistakes in order to become a better ninja, a better strategist, and slowly straightened his back, resolve turning into steel. He would never let his friends down ever again. "Are you going home now, Naruto?" he asked, slouching down again. Naruto turned towards him and smiled, sheepish. Not really, no. I am hungry and I've missed Ichiraku's ramen so much. Which was the truth. The cup Sakura had brought him had sustained him to face the hospital food, but that didn't mean he didn't want more. Besides, he had the feeling that if he stopped to think about the Anbu's offer and Jiraiya's, he would not feel good for a while, so he was planning to eat first, act like nothing was wrong, and then face things afterwards. There were also other things to ponder about. What to do about Akatsuki, what to do about Sasuke, what to do about everything. Just because he had won this time did not mean he wouldn't have to fight soon, and falling into a false sense of security would be his downfall. Would Orochimaru attempt to lure Sasuke away again? Naruto trusted his friend, but he did not trust Orochimaru or Kabuto. He could not let himself believe that everything was fine anymore. What did he accomplish? He had reached Sasuke by sheer luck, and the fact that he had accepted to come back was good, but he couldn't take praise for that. There was nothing to boast about. He wasn't strong enough to back up his claims. Wish I could join you, but mom said to come straight home after meeting you, sorry mutt. Kiba elbowed him in the side, smirking at him. But what about celebration ramen tomorrow? What did you say? Naruto's eyes lit up at the prospect. I'm in. Shikamaru snorted but nodded his consent. He wondered if Choji would be up to join them as well. Niji also nodded, grateful he had been included in the friendly meetup. It felt good to belong not just to his team, but also to a group of friends. The four split up, each of them going into a different direction, and Naruto walked towards the ramen stand feeling lighter. His friends were doing okay, and they were going to spend time together with ramen the following day, and that was good. More than good. Slowly, day after day, he was gaining acknowledgement from more and more people, and who cared if most of the village still disliked him. He would slowly win them all over. For now, he had his friends, Iruka-sensei, Jiraiya the pervert, Tsunade Aba-chan. The rest of them would come with time. Naruto, a deep voice coming from behind him startled him out of his thoughts. He didn't even have to turn around to recognize who had spoken. He could not forget that voice. It was the Anbu who had visited him at the hospital. Naruto's excitement over the prospect of eating ramen quickly disappeared and he suddenly felt overly embarrassed for some reason. He still felt uneasy around the Anbu for no particular reason, and it was only because he had been with Kiba until moments before that he could finally think up of a comparison. He felt like a pup next to a feral adult wolf. Or well, a panther. A feral panther that was not showing any sort of aggressive behavior towards him, and that confused him. He was used to adults treating him with scorn or like he was invisible, but there was something about Haidoku's focus on him that made him feel suddenly in the center of attention, and it was unnerving. Ah, hello. He greeted, halting mid-step and finding himself swiftly heading towards his apartment instead. I mean. Good morning, he corrected himself. Although the man did not laugh at him, Naruto could almost sense the smile under that mask. Fighting the urge to shift away from the imposing figure of the Anbu at his side, Naruto wondered how did it look like from an outsider point of view, watching the village demon's container and the respectable Anbu commander walking side by side. It probably looked like he was being escorted somewhere or just really strange. Maybe not as strange as you think. Naruto's eyes widened. Is he reading my mind? Hayu smirked under the mask at the teen's astonished expression. Anbu don't walk through the village like that, so we might attract some unwanted attention, but there are no rules about who we can interact with. Naruto was now absolutely sure the man was smiling. Too bad he couldn't see his face. Still, the casual reply soothed his worries, and even though he still felt awkward, he relaxed a bit, walking idly down the street as the Anbu matched his pace. The silence between them stretched on, and not liking it, Naruto cleared his throat, searching for something to say. Why a panther? He found himself asking. A split second later, he covered his mouth with one hand, feeling stupid. That wasn't really a question one could ask an Anbu, let alone the commander of the corps, Ri0GHT. Nonetheless, the man didn't seem to mind his curiosity at all, and Naruto felt a bit relieved. Panthers are lethal animals. They can hide themselves in the shadows and attack their prey without warning or sound, moving like silk, mortal and deathly, the Anbu replied. I thought it was pretty neat if I could get my enemies to think of me as one. Naruto stared at the man in awe. He had received a clear answer without being reprimanded for his curiosity, and the man didn't even seem angry about it. Besides, his words held pride for his mask choice, and Naruto could admit that it was a fitting choice for the man. Mood cheerful once more, Naruto smiled up at the Anbu. One of the things everybody knew about the corps was that each of them was allowed to choose the traits of an animal for their mask, and their training often tried to mimic motions and styles that would remind opponents of that animal. Hayu's words held no arrogance to them, either. Each Anbu member receives a blank mask to paint to symbolize their inner traits and power, so that the mask will reflect them for others to see like a mirror of their soul, Hayu continued, eyeing Naruto's reaction curiously. Considering the man's words for a moment, Naruto's face twisted into a grimace before the teen schooled it back to show indifference. I guess I would be pretty boring then, with a fox mask, he shrugged, trying to sound casual. It wasn't like being constantly compared to a fox was an insult for him. There were many characteristics that Naruto shared with that animal, and not just because he was the host of a fox demon, but it did annoy him that he would be forever associated to the Kyuubi no Kitsune, no matter what he could do. Despite that, if things came down to that he would learn to use that to his advantage. He didn't want to be known for the skills of the stupid fox, so if the chance arose, he would definitely pick something else, anything else. Who said that? The carefree tone of the Anbu shocked Naruto just as much as the words he'd spoken. He wondered how a killer could look so detached and sound so carefree whenever he wanted, but then he reminded himself that Anbu at least had a mask, while people like Kakashi-sensei or Jiraiya didn't even have one, and they could move from cheerful to dangerous when the need arose. A person didn't need a real mask in order to hide who they really were. Well, I'm the Kyuubi's vessel, so a hand rose to his face, stopping him. Exactly. You are its vessel. Whatever trait you were told you had in common with the creature you host has nothing to do with who you are. The mask tilted slightly, and Naruto had the impression the Anbu was pointing at where his seal was. You are you, and the demon is the demon. You don't have to feel like you should associate with images that tie you to Kyuubi, simply because you are what keeps it caged. During the first few days after Mizuki revealed to him that he hosted Kyuubi inside him, Naruto had often wondered just how much of what shinobi and villagers thought of him was the truth. He had agonized over whether he was the demon, really, not just its container. If they were all so convinced of it, was Naruto just fooling himself? Then Sandaime had explained it to him in a way that he could understand. A sealing scroll was still just a scroll, it did not become the object it had sealed within it. Like a bowl was still a bowl, not the raiment it contained. And that was the same for Naruto. Just because he hosted Kyuubi did not make him Kyuubi at the same time. And yet it seemed such a hard thing for most people to understand that hearing Hayu say it so casually made Naruto feel once again unbalanced. It seemed to be a common reaction to the Anbu's words. If you want others to realize that you are not the demon, if you want people to consider you for who you are, then you have to be the first to realize that the demon does not define you. You have to recognize the things you accomplished by yourself and keep working with your own strengths. Naruto did not know what to say. The Anbu stopped and looked down at him. Naruto swallowed and looked up, meeting the eyes behind the mask. Once you are aware of where the demon ends and your own self starts, then you will be able to find your own strength, and with your sheer will, I don't see why you wouldn't become a strong ninja on your own. This is why I offered you to enter the Anbu. Our methods might be brutal, but it is through harsh training that you can find your own limits and overcome them. That is what we offer to you, a way to unlock your potential and let it grow. Naruto looked away, mulling over his words, then dared to ask the only question he had been thinking about ever since Hayu had given him his offer. Why? Why me? Why go out of your way to explain yourself? Why indulge my questions? Why? Hayu sighed. This boy, even if he did not know it yet, was the Yondaime's legacy. The Hokage had sacrificed his life to try and save his son and the village, and even if his idea had been for Konoha to see Naruto as a hero, things had not gone the way he had hoped they would. And yet, despite that, Hayu had seen how someone hailed as a prodigy by the village had turned out. It was a miracle Naruto was still willing to fight for Konoha instead of wanting to leave. Naruto had enough determination to control and tame the beast, and he was strong enough on his own to show that the demon wasn't what gave him power, but he was supposed to be happy. Despite everything, Naruto was supposed to have a normal life, not this. What was the point of this all if Yondaime's son couldn't even live his life as he was supposed to? He shouldn't question Hayu's honesty. He shouldn't be used to being treated poorly simply because of the demon. Hayu felt anger bubble under his usual calm composure, and he forced it away. I could tell you that I'm simply looking forwards to seeing how strong you can be if you channel your energies in the right way, or that I think you'd grow to be strong, and I want to add you to my squads, he said, looking ahead towards the busy streets of the village, but the truth is simpler, and it might be less interesting because of that. I just think it would be a waste to prevent you from achieving your dreams, because you were not given the chance to show what you're made of. Oh, Naruto was once again at loss of words. Hayu said it was a simple thing, but to him it meant everything. He had always had to fight to have what for others was a given, and it was as simple as that Hayu was treating him like any other person. Not because he was special, but simply because he had the right to have a chance he wouldn't get otherwise. He started walking again, and the Anbu followed him at his pace. Something had changed though, and even as they fell silent, he did not feel as fidgety and awkward as before. The Anbu at his side didn't feel like an imposing, scary figure anymore. His presence now was almost comforting. I deserve a chance. Naruto found himself grinning. He didn't put me down, he simply thought I would do well and offered me the place to try it. He trusts me enough to say I can become strong, and that's all. It was a weird thing. Iruka had only started to believe in him because he had seen him go against Mizuki. Ibisu hadn't even wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. Jiraiya had dropped him more than once to do things on his own and had only started to believe in him after Naruto had surprised him. Even Tsunade had looked down on him until he had shown her the Rasengan. Kakashi-sensei had thought he wasn't even worth training for the matches because of Sasuke. He wondered if he had changed idea now that Sasuke was back from his attempt at defection. But all of them had only seen Naruto after he had proven himself to be better than their assumptions. He had done nothing to impress Hayu, and he still put his faith in Naruto's growth. The Anbu commander trusted him ahead of time. You have continuously fought to have what others consider a given. Hayu broke the silence, almost as if reading Naruto's mind again. You deserve the same as them. Still, the fact that you've had to fight for everything makes you, in a way, stronger than most. Everyone had always more or less implied that to get what he wanted, attention, acknowledgement, he'd have to fight for every bit of it. And now this man was saying that he deserved it without favoritism or antagonism. Naruto could also see what he meant though. For every small achievement he'd had to fight his hardest, and that gave him an edge because he was used to working hard for the things he wanted. He was not afraid of training to the point of exhaustion. He could see how things worked better than most. He could use this edge to exploit a situation so that it would benefit him because he could see a side of people that most could not. Hirosenin no. I mean, Jiraiya, he hastily corrected himself, not wanting to badmouth the Sennin in front of an Anbu guard. He said he wanted me to join him as his apprentice. Away from Konoha for 3 years. He hadn't really wanted to tell that to the Anbu, but he still did. He guessed that the Anbu wouldn't hold it against him for having another option to choose from. Oh, that is honor. The Anbu had known Jiraiya would make his counter move. After all, it was only fair. Is that what you want then? Naruto hesitated. I want to be stronger, that's something I've always wanted, he replied hesitantly. Maybe this time he would concentrate on me instead of doing his research. Last time I had to work all on my own, he muttered, referring to the way Jiraiya had only given him a hint to learn the Rasengan steps and then had left to gather some info at the local onsen. The Sennin wasn't really a bad teacher. Naruto was aware the man had just wanted to test him and keep him busy, and that was coupled with the fact that he was pretty sure Jiraiya lacked people skills, or just his interact with teenagers skills were sort of lacking. Either way, he could understand his motives, and had it been any other person but Naruto, he guessed it would have been effective. But it wasn't. Not with him. Naruto had never had positive attention given to him, and Jiraiya's careless attitude only enraged him and made him feel uncared for. He guessed he just had bad luck with teachers after Iruka-sensei. Kakashi had done the same, after all. Maybe he was cursed with the teachers who think they're doing the best thing while actually messing shit up. Curse. He desperately needed someone who would dedicate attention to him just as much as they did to others. It wasn't even egoistic because Naruto didn't demand full attention. He just asked for the same as everybody else. Hayu remained silent, watching as Naruto seemed to consider what to say next. But I am not sure this would work out the way I wanted, he finally blurted out. Besides he looked anywhere but at Hayu and finally spit out what he was thinking. It'd feel like I'm running away. He stopped again, fidgeting, and then he rushed to explain himself, not wanting the man to get the wrong idea. I mean, it's not like I wouldn't love to be trained by Jiraiya. He's an old pervert, but he's strong and he knows a lot of things about everything. It's just that I love Konoha. I really do. And I want to be Hokage. But 3 years is a lot of time. And what would I miss if I left? Isn't a Hokage supposed to know and love his village? Would that really help me? Can't I learn everything while still having a stable base here? He ruffled his hair, annoyed at his own inability to explain himself. He was really bad with words. It felt like it was important for him to stay. Sasuke had wanted to run away and now he wasn't anymore. Naruto wasn't abandoning his village by leaving, but it still felt like he was. There was too much of Konoha that he still couldn't understand, and would he lose what little he had learned by leaving? He'd only seen the evil glares of a lot of the civilians, he'd only seen their bad side. He loved the place, but there was so much of it that he'd only caught a glimpse of. It was important, or at least it felt like that to him, that he was allowed to learn everything now. Not later. Now. Before. Hayu let out a soft sigh, but he nodded. He could understand what Naruto was saying and even more what he wasn't saying. What if the world outside was more welcoming than Konoha? What if he found somewhere he liked more, somewhere that liked him more? What if he found himself starting to dislike Konoha for everything? Naruto wanted to steal his love for Konoha first. It meant that somewhere deep inside, the kid was aware that he still didn't love it as much as he proclaimed. Naruto would give his life for his friends, but would that love stand tall even in the face of protecting the whole of Konoha? He could say it would, but he hid inside himself a seed of doubt nonetheless. And yet, Hayu understood, because this confused person was young and there were so many incognita in front of him. Hayu's view of the village was as a whole. He didn't think of it as single individuals, and even if he did, they were all worth saving for the sole reason that they were part of the village. This sort of ideal was what Naruto needed to learn. This place gave birth to many worth shinobi, just like it did to unworthy ones, and to nice villagers just the same as stupid uncouth ones. But they were old people, and the only reason they needed to be protected was that this was the place that had given birth to him, the place he belonged to, and one that, despite those against it, loved him. Of course, the village was biased against Naruto, and he could never learn this truth by being himself, not yet. He was too young to make a name out of himself, they wouldn't believe in him. But this could change if Naruto chose the path of the Anbu. Of course, this wasn't fair. Hayu was painfully aware of that, but if this was the only way to give Naruto a chance, then Naruto, he said, compelling the teen to look at him again. Are you convinced that staying here would let you learn how to understand and love all of Konoha? I won't lie to you. I can't offer you false reassurances. Many here despise your very existence, and it will be hard to gain their acknowledgement, let alone their respect, Naruto huffed. I know this, he replied, looking miffed. I know, but they just did not know him, nor did they want to get to know him. But he would make it so they would not be allowed to look away. And if in the end they still disliked him, well, Naruto could live with knowing not everybody loved him. It was okay. He knew some people were suffering because of Kyuubi's memory parading in front of them in orange clothes and a loud voice. He could understand that. But he was still going to try for their hearts nonetheless. It was important that even if they never found in them to care about him, that they at least acknowledged that he was different from the demon he contained. That he would never do anything to harm them or Konoha. Hayu hadn't said it would be impossible to win them over. He just said it would be hard. I know you want to get results now. But rushing never helps, especially when you are a ninja. You're gaining more support day by day, but you're failing to see the small achievements because your eyes are set on the ending result, which is still out of your grasp. What do you mean? Naruto frowned, confused. You want to be Hokage because this way people will recognize you, right? At Naruto's nod, Hayu continued, but being Hokage doesn't mean you will be automatically respected. It's actually the opposite. The respect will make you become Hokage, not the other way around. Building your strength, showing Konoha's citizens that you are reliable and love the village, this is what will make the change. The blonde froze in mid-step. This was the first time someone actually talked to him about his dream, acknowledging it as something possible, but it was also the first time someone worded it in such a way. He hadn't thought of it like that, ever. He had assumed that once Hokage, the village surely would. Being Hokage is more than just being strong and reliable, Naruto. Try to think about Sarutobi-sama. Naruto licked his dry lips. He couldn't remember a time when Sandaime hadn't been taking some time to just walk around the village, smiling at the children, talking with the villagers and the shinobi, inquiring about their lives. He hadn't been just a great strategist or a great shinobi, he'd been a great person, too. One that people could respect and love. The man had truly cared for the village with all his heart. So maybe Sandaime had kept Kyuubi's existence from him. So maybe he had made some mistakes in his life and Naruto had felt some resentment towards him at first. But that did not mean he loved him any less or that Sandaime was a lesser person because of it. The memory of the now deceased Hokage brought forth a sharp pain in his chest. Sandaime had been a great Hokage, yes. He had lived for the sole purpose of his village and he had died to protect it, believing that it would rise again. If you want to be appreciated, you don't have to be overly strong or cunning, you just have to show it with the little things. It might be harsh to hear that, but as you are now, the village would not allow you to learn about the everyday life. If you really wish to see how any other person sees it, this is why you should choose the Anbu. You could see a side of Konoha that normally is not for you to see. You'd learn how people act, and by doing so you'd learn more about them, and this in turn would let you find ways to make yourself useful once you are living there as yourself. It is not a painless path, and it is not a short one, but it is one that might bear some fruits. Naruto blinked. Hayu snorted, the sound muffled by the mask. But don't be mistaken. If you pass the test, you will spend 3 years exclusively doing missions with us. You won't be Naruto anymore. You will just be a faceless Anbu newbie. You would have to train harder than you've ever had to and give it your all without questions asked. 3 years to see this village the way it should have been for you. The straightforward speech made Naruto feel strangely better. He was putting down his cards without hiding anything, treating him like an adult. For this man, the commander of the Anbu, Haidoku Naruto, was worth a chance. Once again, Hayu answered the unspoken question, as if reading his mind. The man truly had a scary gift. It is because you deserve the chance, and I think it would be the right choice. Because I believe in your potential. I believe in you. Naruto looked away, the honesty making his chest feel painfully tight, and when he glanced at his side again, the Anbu was gone, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the street. Iruka-san. Iruka turned around, face set into a frown as he muttered something under his breath about how unwanted visits always happened when he wanted to go check on Naruto, but upon seeing who was calling out for him, his displeasure melted into a small smile. He had been trying to find Naruto, who had already left the hospital before he could get there and was now somewhere in the village, possibly at Ichiraku. But he guessed Naruto would have to wait a bit longer. Ah, Raidu-san, good afternoon, he replied politely, fighting the urge to twist his smile into a much more fitting smirk. It is unusual to see you around the academy, did you need me? Raidu's face, as expected from a jounin of his level, showed nothing of his inner amusement, lifting a package he'd been holding so that Iruka could see it, he offered it to the younger man, who made a show of picking it up with an exaggerated confused face. Aware that there were other shinobi and civilians walking around them, Iruka kept his face schooled into a curious frown as he looked down at the sealed package. What is this? Raidu had to inwardly snort. He had somehow missed the silent private kind of fun, it felt highly refreshing, sharing a silly act with a friend. I was told it contains a few academy books that were mistakenly sent to the Hokage's office this morning, he explained, tone low and laced with warmth. I was sent to the academy to give it back but couldn't find anyone. You were still around, so I thought you would know what to do with them. I hope the mistake didn't cause you any inconvenience. The weight of the package was familiar to Iruka's hands in a way he could not fully explain in words. It was like an old comforting burden that he had accepted after a long period, but that instead of feeling heavy on his shoulders was more like gentle warmth surrounding him. He welcomed it with a wry smile. Ah, I was wondering why we hadn't received them yet. Thank you, Raidu-san, he smiled at him. I can't wait to unpack and use the books with my students. Raidu's polite smile was more of a smirk now than a grin. Well then, I'll be off, Iruka-san, goodbye. With that, Raidu disappeared in a small swirl of leaves. Iruka was still smiling, holding the precious book package into his arms, but his smile faltered when he felt another chakra signature flicker behind him. Hello there, Iruka-sensei. Kakashi was standing there, looking as happy and cheerful as ever, waving at him. Iruka groaned, slightly peeved. In the past few days, Kakashi had visited him rather often, and ever since Naruto and Sasuke had returned, he seemed to have taken a liking to interrupting him at random, and Iruka was starting to feel uncomfortable with that. What did someone like Kakashi want from him? If Iruka had been a fellow jounin, then the fact that Kakashi seemed to want to keep in contact with him would be understandable, but Iruka was a chunin and a teacher at the academy. There was no reason for Kakashi to want to be this friendly with him. The only thing they had in common was that they both cared for Naruto, and maybe with a stretch, Kakashi wanted to repent for his actions and understand Naruto more, but, unfortunately, Iruka did not think that was it. Or better then, Kakashi probably did want to repent, but this was not the reason he was bothering him. Iruka had a vague idea of what Kakashi was hinting at, but he seriously didn't believe it would be anything serious, not really. That was why the package the jounin has sent him was still unopened on his kitchen table, as he did not dare try to open it in fear of what it would contain. Kakashi's tastes were rather questionable, what with his perverted books, and Iruka did not want to know. At all. Despite all that, Iruka could have entertained the idea of forming some sort of friendship with the man if he hadn't been popping around uninvited at all the most inconvenient times, such as during his academy lessons or in his private time. Kakashi was a nice person, and even if his people skills were somewhat lacking, Iruka could address them in time and kick him into the right direction, but he wasn't entirely convinced he wanted to at the same time. As said before, Kakashi had no cognition of when to butt in. He guessed he could reserve a judgment until he decided Kakashi was no danger for his sanity. If that was the case, then he would accept Kakashi's offer of friendship and see where that lead them. Kakashi-sensei, he greeted. At first he had referred to the jounin with a more formal address, but with the recent visits he had decided to indulge to a more familiar wording, but still keep a good distance, just in case. What are you doing here? I heard Naruto was allowed out of the hospital and decided to drop by, Kakashi smiled under his mask. Also, I heard something you might want to know. Iruka frowned and scratched the bridge of his nose. What? Jiraiya-sama offered Naruto the chance to travel with him for 3 years, all the while training him as his apprentice. This is the reason I'm going to see him, to settle a few things before he leaves. Knowing Jiraiya, the two will be gone the moment he knows Naruto has everything ready, possibly even sooner than that. Iruka's eyebrow threatened to move upwards, but he quickly schooled his expression into the expected mix of surprise and concern. He wondered how Kakashi had gotten the news, since neither of the Sannin had wanted the proposal to be revealed too soon. He guessed Kakashi was far too good at finding information when he wanted to. And you know this how? He started walking again, and Kakashi followed him. Did you spy again on Tsunade-sama and Jiraiya-sama? Ma, Kakashi scratched the back of his head, closing his visible eye and laughing meekly. It wasn't really spying. Iruka barely restrained himself from swatting Kakashi like he did with his students, but he knew it wouldn't be a good idea to act upon such childish behavior. Besides, it would be impolite, the two of them were not at that close level of acquaintance yet. Not that he wished they were, but the itch to hit him was quite strong. Are you sure about that? He asked instead, appearing even more worried. Kakashi nodded. I heard Tsunade speaking with Jiraiya this morning, so it's confirmed news. Iruka remained quiet, pondering over Kakashi's position on the whole situation. He seemed to be convinced that Naruto would say yes, and if Iruka didn't know any better, he would have thought the situation to be ideal for the teen, everything considered. But as it was, he knew that wasn't all of it. Not at all. Undisturbed by Iruka's sudden silence, which he interpreted as worry for his student, Kakashi pulled his most recent book from a pocket of his vest and flicked it open to where he'd stopped earlier. Iruka glared at him, clenching his hands to stop himself from ripping the book from his hands, and tried to dispel the anger by mentally counting down from 100. It didn't really help much, but he managed. Kakashi simply grinned under his mask. Naruto stared at the walls of his apartment with some sort of apathy, a small grimace on his lips. He had returned to his apartment, thinking that maybe he would forego his ramen need and just focus on the choice offered to him, but once there he found out someone had preceded him. The front door was open wide, the lock broken apart, and although it seemed like the vandals had not destroyed anything of his possessions, aside from making a mess of his room, they had left some nasty messages scribbled on his walls in black and red ink, and that pissed him off more than a bit. Most of the insults were slurred and written with uncertain hand, not to mention full of glaring mistakes, so Naruto supposed the people who had broken into his house were drunk, not thinking straight, but the fact remained that his walls were dirty, and someone had shoved all his photos onto the floor, smashing the frames so the shards of glass were everywhere. Not a nice picture to come home to. It was disturbing that someone had taken it upon themselves to find some paint, smash his door down, and then leave without a trace, but he guessed they hadn't wanted to stick around any longer in the den of the monster. At least it was just paint, not blood. That would have been really creepy. It was also the first time something like this had happened. Usually people were more meek in their dislike, a few muttered words of hatred, a lot of glares, a shop owner asking him to leave, or refusing to sell him things at normal prices, if at all, and there was one time during the celebration for Kyuubi's defeat that someone had thrown a rock at his window, but, well, nothing like this. They had never dared to break into his home. Rolling his eyes at the situation, annoyed that he'd have to clean it up by himself, he moved to the small kitchen and grabbed a broom, sweeping the floor first so he wouldn't step on a shard of glass while cleaning. The pictures were not ruined, so he'd only have to switch the frames, and he really hoped whoever the drunken person had been, that they hadn't vomited anywhere in his apartment, so he felt it wasn't as bad as it could have been. "I am not a fox, idiots," he snorted, starting to clean the wall with a sponge and a bucket of water. TSK, I thought people were more intelligent than that, geez, and it's written with just one N, not two. He scrubbed at the wall, but the sponge only managed to smudge the paint a bit. Waterproof, huh? Would it be worth to keep scrubbing in hopes it washed off, or should he paint the wall again? Amusingly, he did not really feel angered or annoyed or hurt by this obvious act of vandalism. Maybe it was because of Hayu's words, maybe it was because he was used to it and could see it as what it was, the act of a drunken person who didn't think it through, but he wasn't as bothered as he should have been. Had this happened years before, Naruto was sure it would have hurt, but as it was, this stupid act, with all its grammar errors splattered on his walls, was more pathetic than hurtful. "Yo, Naruto. Boy, Naruto, it's me, Iruka-sensei, you weren't at the hospital so." Iruka's voice stopped abruptly as he and Kakashi entered through the door and saw the painted walls and the broken frames Naruto had placed on his bed. Iruka gasped in shock, and Kakashi's visible eye narrowed in clear anger. "Naruto? Who did this?" Naruto turned around, stopping mid-motion. "I dunno," he replied, shrugging. "Someone who missed a few lessons at the academy, I think. They don't even know how to write," he snorted. "It's waterproof though, do you think I should paint it over or?" Iruka took a step towards the blonde, feeling dread fill his heart, but was stopped by Naruto's calm stare. The teen didn't look depressed nor bothered, which was probably even more worrisome. "Iruka-sensei, you worry too much." He grinned at him, poking the wall with a finger. "This means nothing. It'd take something worse to get me riled up. Though I am not sure I'll have the money to pay for the paint. I wonder if Tsunade-bachan would give it to me for free if I asked." Iruka and Kakashi were taken aback by Naruto's carefree attitude, and Kakashi couldn't help a small smile. Naruto was growing up, and it was good to see that something like this would not push him down. Still, if Naruto would not get angry at this, Kakashi would for him. It was a disgusting act, and he would get to the bottom of this and find the culprit. Iruka's shoulders relaxed despite his worry, sincerely proud of his boy. "Well, seems to me like a D-rank mission," Kakashi said smoothly, hiding his anger inside himself. "I think a genin team will find they are lucky enough that they get to paint a wall today." Naruto stared at him, then smiled brightly at that, reminded of a time when he thought D-rank missions were the worst thing ever. He did not envy the poor genins who would have to work for him. He was glad Kakashi was showing him his support without pity or anger. "How does one apply for a mission anyway?" Naruto asked, looking at Iruka. "You should head to the Hokage Tower and talk with Shizune, she'll show you where the papers to sign are," he answered gently. "Besides, once she knows what it is for, she will inform Tsunade and she will make sure the culprit is rightfully punished." Kakashi looked at the broken lock on the door with a hidden grimace. I suggest you to sleep somewhere else tonight as well, it is not safe if you cannot close your door properly." Naruto shrugged. "I don't think whoever did this would come back while I'm here," he reasoned, but at a glare from both his sensei he cowered. Okay. I will go somewhere else, okay? No need to look at me like that." Iruka did not like the idea to leave everything as it was, so he helped Naruto pick up the photos and remove them from the broken frames, then promised he would fix them as soon as possible, and suggested Naruto to pick up the things he didn't want to leave there and bring them over to the Hokage's office, so Tsunade could give him a place to store them in the meantime. Naruto saluted with a smirk, but did as he was told, gathering a few clothes in a bag and staring at his plants with a frown. He couldn't move them, but he couldn't let them stay there either. Besides, whether he decided to join the Anbu or Jiraiya, he'd have to find someone to water them while he was gone. Asking for a long-term D rank didn't seem viable even if he was sure the painting would be kindly taken care of without him paying for it. He did not want to stretch it too far with his plants, but he didn't have the money to actually pay for such a long time. He'd have to ask one of his friends maybe, or even Iruka-sensei himself. He'd have to find a solution soon. Iruka observed him for a while, still concerned. He didn't seem hurt by the obvious disrespect to his house, and the teacher had to wonder what this meant for him. It was true that Naruto's house was mostly bare, and everything he held dear he shoved into his small bedroom, but it had to have some sort of meaning to him, right? Or maybe it was just a place Naruto returned to at night. Iruka had to admit that Naruto seemed the kind of person who wouldn't think much of his house, at least not now. He lived alone and cared more about his training than anything else. Iruka had to wonder if this would change in the future, if Naruto would find a place maybe somewhere else, rather than in this palace where he could feel truly at home. A place he could love. He hoped so. Naruto really was the most surprising ninja, after all. Jiraiya and Tsunade stared at Naruto with trepidation. He was standing in front of them, chin held high, and it was clear he had picked his answer already, and they were both trying to hide their interest. Of course, both Sanin had been informed of what had happened to his apartment, just as Iruka had predicted. Tsunade's countenance had been barely held in check, and there was a conspicuous hole in the desk, fist-sized, that was currently hidden under a pile of paperwork. Jiraiya himself had been seething, and the two elders had indulged in more than one cup of sake before getting ready to face Naruto. Tsunade had allowed Kakashi to start an investigation on the matter, of course, but wanted to be alerted before the copy nin did anything to the culprit once found. She'd call dibs. The fact that Naruto hadn't seemed bothered by the situation only served to remind them that he was his own person and his reactions were different than their own. Yet, Tsunade was proud of him for that. He had built a shield against the cruelty from the village, and rather than lash out he was calm and collected. Still, she would never let anything like that happen ever again. Shizune was standing outside of the room with a pretense of fixing the paperwork for the new D-rank mission, but actually listening on them, one ear pressed against the door. None of the three occupants flinched or showed any surprise when a figure appeared out of nowhere after having sent a pulse of his chakra as a warning. Hayu took place on the right of Tsunade's desk, keeping quiet. Naruto inhaled deeply, knowing it was time to speak up now that all participants were in the room. "Tsunade Bach-an," he started, smirking as a twitch developed at the side of her eye. "Iro-sen and I had some time to think about what to do." He nodded to Hayu, who nodded back, acknowledging his words. Tsunade and Jiraiya stood straighter, feeling the seriousness of the situation creep on them. He hadn't used their official names, preferring to still use his nicknames for them, and they understood what he was trying to say. "I really thought about it," Naruto continued. "Training with you, Hiro-senin, would make me one of the happiest people alive, and you can't understand how much it means to me that you actually want to train me." Naruto flashed him his foxy smile. "I know you are one of the best teachers I could have, no matter if you spend half a day peeping in the onsen, or if you do your researches by spying on naked women." Jiraiya cleared his throat, not knowing if he was being praised or insulted, and Tsunade coughed threateningly at him. "But I can't come with you. I don't want to leave Konoha." He fumbled with his words, trying to find a way to explain his decision. "Iruka-sensei once told me that the village is trying hard to get itself back together after Orochimaru and Sand attacked, and to gain back its status and strength in front of the other countries. Konoha now needs all the shinobi it has, and even though most of the civilians think the opposite, Konoha needs me, too," he concluded, shrugging the feeling of embarrassment as the three adults stared hard at him. As disappointing as it was to hear him say that, Jiraiya had known it would end like that. Even if he hadn't wanted to admit it. Because Naruto was different from him. "I might not love all the people that live in Konoha," Naruto coughed sheepishly. "But this is the place Sandaime died to protect. This is what Yondaime died for, too. This is the place where I was born, where my friends were born, where all of you now live, my precious people." Naruto beamed at them. "The place you are all protecting right now. I want to become stronger so that I can protect this place too, without boasting off a power I don't have." He wanted to gain Konoha's love because the village had caught his heart the moment he had been old enough to think. He'd seen only one side of it, but he still couldn't help it. At first, he'd wanted to be Hokage simply to show the villagers that he existed and that he didn't deserve their hatred, but now he wanted to become Hokage to protect the village. And maybe it would matter in the end. He would become Hokage, not to be recognized, but to devote himself to protect. This was his decision. This was his Nindo. "I want to stay," he stated, facing both Tsunade and Jiraiya, and then he glanced over at Hayu, still silent. "I want to see everything of Konoha, and for that reason, Iro-sennin, I cannot come with you." Jiraiya inhaled slowly, then exhaled equally slowly, and nodded. Because deep down, after layers of bitterness and weariness, he felt the same. Maybe he had never cared for Konoha like his teacher and student had, but he could understand why Naruto had decided to walk down that path, and he would be at his side all the while, and would do it proudly. Naruto made the decision that Jiraiya had been too weak to make, and he would respect that. "Tsunade Oba-chan, Iro-sennin, Hidoku-san, I want to be an Anbu." Tsunade stared at the three shinobi standing in front of her with serious eyes. All of them were Anbu, all of them wearing their masks, and they were waiting for her to speak first without moving, so still they resembled four statues. Hayu was the first in line, standing in the front and closer to her than the other two. She sighed, turning her attention to the remaining Anbu. Both were slightly shorter than their commander, with different builds and stances. The first of the two had short cropped hair coming out messily from a brown band tied on the back of his head. He looked lean and thin, with a body made for speed and running, and his mask was painted to resemble a dog. Lesser fierce than a wolf in appearance but equally dangerous in a fight. The other was the shortest of the three, with a low ponytail and a more sturdy body, still on the thin side. The mask covering his face was that of a mouse, long muzzle and small eyes. Tsunade couldn't tell much just by observing them, but her training as a medic allowed her some more leeway in terms of simple deduction by sight. She had expected the two retired Anbu to still be shinobi of the leaf, whether they were on active duty or not, but either way they both seemed healthy and fit, sign they kept training even after leaving Anbu service. She couldn't help but wonder why they had decided to come back to service in the Anbu ranks after so many years of inactivity. "Tsunade-sama, as you requested, these two are the shinobi who reapplied for Anbu service. Their previous codenames were Shadow Tracker," he pointed at the dog, and Haunting Silence, he nodded at the mouse. The Hokage nodded. Those names were not familiar to her, though she had been away from the village enough years that even familiar names wouldn't mean much anymore, and they seemed intriguing enough. How had the two acquired such codenames? The Anbu's titles were testament of the hidden strengths and skills of each member, and were chosen specifically to give an aura of danger. She would have to inquire about their names to Hayu in private once the two Anbu were away. They both asked to keep the reasons for their coming back private, but they will disclose it if you truly want to know, Hayu continued, bowing to the Hokage to show her that his words meant no disrespect. Their applications were accepted without trouble, and they have as of now been reinstated within our ranks. We are glad to have their skills and assets back. But the flicker of his wrist, Hayu motioned for the two to step forwards, and they did so without hesitation. Tsunade fixed her eyes on the taller of the two, Shadow Tracker, and nodded at him. The man, with a side glance to his commander that Tsunade did not catch, slowly brought one hand up to his face and pulled the dog mask away. The Hokage's eyebrows shifted upwards as she could admit familiarity with the person in front of her, but was unable to recall his name. The only thing she could say about him was that he seemed very good at blending with the backgrounds, even while on duty, never attracting attention on himself. She vaguely remembered using his services once or twice to retrieve something from the archives, but even then he had kept a low profile. He had a scar on his face, but despite what should have been an easily identifiable mark, she still had trouble remembering him or anything interesting about him. "Namiashi Raidu, Hokage-sama," the man said quietly, noticing her perplexed gaze. His tone held a hint of satisfaction, as if his primary purpose was to be forgotten. Tsunade nodded, leaving it at that. She could guess now why part of his codename quoted the shadows. "Your skills are indeed proof of your past as an Anbu," she murmured, nodding at him. Raidu's lips twitched in a smile, accepting her praise. Tsunade moved her attention to the remaining member, and in doing so she felt a shiver creep up her back. The man's hand hesitated briefly in front of his mask before his fingers gripped its edges tightly and he slowly pulled it down. Tsunade was met with a pair of brown, gentle eyes and a familiar scar running through the bridge of the shinobi's nose, and her eyes widened in honest surprise. "Iruka," she breathed out, completely taken aback. The man had appeared average at best for his Shunin qualification, mild and well-behaved, but definitely nothing special. She could not believe that the person Naruto admired and considered his brother could be someone like him, an Anbu. The academy teacher smirked, and a dangerous glint flashed through his eyes, chasing away the previous gentleness. "Yes, Hokage-sama," he answered. "I was part of the Anbu." As Naruto sat in front of the Hokage desk, he had to snort inwardly. He had been there more times in the past few days than he had in the whole year, so much that he was starting to memorize the cracks on the wall in front of him. He didn't like waiting, but unfortunately the Hokage was a busy woman. Still, the fact that he'd been there more than he'd been at Ichiraku Ramen was unsettling. Scary. He would have to rectify this soon. This time though it was just him, Tsunade and Hayu, who was standing on the side of the desk, silent and observing him from behind his panther mask. The man's presence was now rather familiar to him, and it was a sure sign that his life was changing. Once he had made up his mind about joining the Anbu, that hesitation that had haunted him until then had coiled and snapped, leaving behind only a strong sense of excitement. This was the same Anbu that had countless adventures told by civilians and shinobi alike. Naruto would have a chance to train under this man, whose power was so intense that even Naruto could tell, just by looking at him, and Naruto wasn't known to be the most attentive person. This was something he wanted to do, and now he just couldn't wait to start. If we want to give you a working cover, we need to create the perfect illusion. Tsunade finally broke the silence, scattering some papers on her desk while searching for one in particular. She was still unconvinced that Naruto's choice was the right one, but she would support him nonetheless. The sudden disappearance would give the opportunity to the council to label you as a missing nin, so you will need to parade around your choice to follow Jiraiya as his apprentice. This will be your cover for the most part of the next 3 years, and during this period you will be under Hayu's direct responsibility, living in the Anbu headquarters. Naruto hastily nodded. This would work. He could easily do it. Jiraiya will not be able to stick around for the whole 3 years, but he seemed agreeable to renting a house in a nearby town in order to check up on you, brat. Tsunade offered Naruto a small smile, and he felt like Jiraiya had just showed him his support since the man hadn't wanted to stick around more than needed. He still needs to keep his information web working, but you will have the chance to meet up with him a few times nonetheless and receive the latest information regarding Akatsuki and Itagakure. Naruto smiled brightly, feeling impressed despite himself. Having Jiraiya decide to stay closer just so that he could check on him was unexpected, yes, but pleasant. Tsunade couldn't help it. Naruto, are you sure? Tsunade Bachan, I won't go back to my word. Yes, I am sure. This is what I want, so don't worry about me. How could I not, stupid Gaki? She thought, shaking her head. Naruto's determination was far too familiar for her to continue, so she just gave up. Now, to review what you are required to do. She held a paper in front of her eyes and scanned it quickly. To become an Anbu you will need to pass their test. It is not a public gathering like the Chunin or Jounin exams, and the rules are specific for that test. When the time comes, Hayu himself will inform you as to what you are expected to do. She paused, pondering over the last part. If you manage to pass the test, you will be considered an Anbu member, and you will be placed in a squad with a captain and 2 other teammates, which have been reinstalled as Anbu members just recently. It was not her time to divulge the information of who exactly one of those 2 old Anbu was, so she kept quiet about it. Iruka would tell him when the time was right. To find out that the Michunin instructor at the academy had been an esteemed Anbu had shaken Tsunade to the core. He'd been rather good at hiding his real capabilities, as he did look more like a teacher than a killer. At least the silent guy Raidu, his name was Raidu, had looked more apt at that than Iruka had. Is that all? Naruto asked, eyes brimming with excitement as he shifted on the chair. I will have to start boasting about my training with Jiraiya then, he mused, bowing uncertainly to Hayu and then waving at the Hokage, who smiled at him amusedly, a bit surprised at his attempt to be somewhat polite. The teen left the room, also waving at Shizune as he passed by. She smiled, glad to see him so energetic still. After Naruto had left, Hayu remained standing still for a moment longer before conceding himself a satisfied smile that Tsunade did not see. Knowing that Naruto had accepted his offer rather than that of Jiraiya meant a lot to him. Unfortunately now Hayu had to face the Hokage once again, this time to disclose a secret that had been protected within the Anbu ranks for many years now. A secret that as the new Hokage she had the right to know, especially now. It would not be easy. Hokage-sama, he started, moving to attract her attention. As you may recall, I previously mentioned that 3 shinobi were going to be reinstated into Anbu active duty. You have met the first 2, but there is a third who has asked to come back within our ranks. He has been on a long-term mission for the past few years, and he is a special case. Tsunade groaned. She had felt suspicious when Hayu had lingered behind after Naruto had left, and now she knew why this sounded like bad news. She hated bad news. And why, pray tell, is this third shinobi a special case? She asked reluctantly, even though she really did not want to know. Hayu took a deep breath. It was sheer luck that Naruto's friends had decided to gather together to eat ramen, because it posed a perfect stage to start working on his cover-up lie. He did not like having to lie to his friends about his whereabouts, but he knew the need for confidentiality, and it wasn't that they wouldn't be able to keep it a secret, but it wasn't just his secret to keep. They were sitting at the counter, one next to the other, slurping their lunch, and Naruto was glad to see that Chaoji had managed to join them. Shino was apparently busy with something family-related, at least that was what Kiba had said, and none of the boys had thought about inviting any of the girls. which was probably going to come back and bite them in the butt later on, Naruto was sure about it. You shitty lucky bastard. Kiba slapped Naruto's back hard, smirking. You're going to be trained by one of the Sannin. Now, see that you keep your boasting to a minimum, I'm still going to kick your butt when you come back. Naruto's lips twitched up into a smirk, feeling the sparkle of friendly competition burn inside him. Maybe he wasn't going to train with Jiraiya, but he was so going to kick Kiba's butt afterwards. His friends would not know about his decision to try as an Anbu, but just for this once Naruto would keep something for himself and enjoy the opportunity without feeling guilty or terrible about it. It was a rare opportunity, a chance that he had been offered to make up for a lifetime of hardships, and he was going to milk it dry. In a way, it was better that the others didn't know, at least not for now. So, when are you going to leave? Shikamaru swallowed his modest mouthful of noodles and stared at him. For the past few days he had felt that something was off with Naruto, but now he seemed just as happy and satisfied as always, and he couldn't understand what had changed. Was it the anticipation for traveling with Jiraiya that had set him back to his old self? Shikamaru really didn't want to read too much into it, but it seemed like it came natural to him, like breathing and sleeping. Troublesome. Hiro Sennin doesn't like to be stuck in the same place for too long, so he said I have to get ready to leave by tomorrow, was the answer as Naruto polished his second ramen bowl. Just gonna get my bags ready first. Neji had remained mostly silent during Naruto's recounting about Jiraiya's offer, eating his own food quietly, but he allowed himself a small smile as he heard Naruto's excitement at the prospect. With all the things Naruto had done for others, it was time someone decided to give him something back. He deserved this chance to get stronger. Boy, what did the prick say about this? Kiba had no trouble mentioning Sasuke in a casual conversation, whereas others like Neji and Shikamaru would have avoided to indirectly call attention to him after their rescue mission. Naruto snorted. I bet he feels neglected. The first person Naruto had told about Jiraiya's training had been Sasuke. He still felt like he deserved to be the first to know stuff, even if that stuff was just a fabrication and not the full truth, but his teammates' reaction to the news has been rather unexpected. Naruto had been afraid that Sasuke would feel once again robbed of an opportunity, but he shouldn't have worried too much. He seemed okay with it, he replied with a shrug, still surprised about it. He said he would wait for me to come back so we can spar together. Eyes wide in surprise, Kiba glanced at Naruto, lips twitching into a small pout. I will never believe that, he stated curtly, poking Naruto again as he grinned mockingly at his friend, his canines showing. Come on, now. Really? What did he say? Naruto's smirk matched his own. No, I mean it, he chuckled. Sasuke might be a butt, but I don't know, it's okay between us, he shrugged. It really was. Besides, Sasuke was making an effort with all of this friendship thing, so Naruto could see that he was really doing something to change. Jiraiya's training style wouldn't suit him, and training under the man would be hellish for someone like Sasuke. Jiraiya was more like Naruto in that sense. He'll be okay with staying here, and he has Kakashi-sensei who will teach him more about the Sharingan, so he doesn't need someone like Hiro Sennin, he concluded. Kiba was about to say something else, but a light nudge in his shin by Shikamaru's foot made him reconsider. None of Naruto's friends liked the Uchiha prick, and they all privately thought having him back in the village was actually the worst outcome possible, but they did not want to say that in front of Naruto, since he still cared about him. It would take a lot for them to start considering Sasuke not just a friend, but a simple ally. That meant that Kiba could be as harsh as he wanted when dealing with the prick, which was a plus. It didn't matter if the two had resolved whatever conflict they had. Sasuke was a bastard, and Kiba never did like bastards. Naruto saw the glint in Kiba's eyes, and the prankster in him recognized it for what it meant, but he decided to let Sasuke have it. He had betrayed not just Konoha the moment he tried leaving, but all his classmates and the people who had started to consider him a comrade. If he wanted to have them back, he'd better be prepared to do the Uchiha version of groveling. As he looked at the four that had gathered together with him, Naruto felt an acute need to come out with the actual truth. It was bad that he was finally able to have friends his age, and he had to lie to them, but he also knew he could not spill secrets that were not just his to have. Every Anbu trainee had to keep the same secret from their own friends, and Naruto wasn't the first, nor the last. It was for the best of the village, after all. Besides, he couldn't be a hypocrite. His friends still did not know about the Kyuubi, which was at least a secret that was his own to divulge, and that was an even bigger and deadlier secret to keep than that of being in the Anbu. SS class secret, and he was the only one able to reveal it to someone without the express permission from the Hokage. I'm not ready yet for that, he mused, watching as his friends watched Chaoji inhale his fourth bowl. He had spent most of his life being hated for something he did not know, and now that he knew, he was super conscious about who to reveal his secret to. There were times he thought none of his friends would reject him, and then he thought back at how most of his teammates had tried to ignore him only because their parents had asked them to, and his security vacillated. He trusted them, of course, but the fear was still present in him. He just needed to wait until the moment was right and then he would tell them and accept whatever reaction would come. Just a little longer. Boy, dope, Sasuke's voice shook him out of his thoughts and he turned around to welcome his teammate's arrival. Of all what was happening between them, having to keep secrets from Sasuke and then demanding him to be honest all the time was a bit unfair on him, but once again Naruto had to convince himself he was doing the right thing. In another, ideal universe, maybe the two of them would have grown as friends and maybe would have joined Anbu together. This was not this ideal world. He wondered if Sasuke would apply in the future. Considering Naruto's luck, with his skills Sasuke would be probably accepted within their ranks faster than he could. Naruto pushed the thought away from his mind. There was no reason to think about it now. This was something for him alone, and it was better not to think about Sasuke in relation to it. He wasn't even sure if Sasuke would be allowed to return to his career as a shinobi without restrictions, so it was better not to think too much about the possible afterwards. "Yo, team," Naruto answered him, smiling. Sasuke had managed to get out from the hospital sooner than expected, simply because he had been adamant about it. He still needed to recover, and there were still faint traces of bruises all over his body, visible for everybody to see, but he wasn't as bad as he had been before, and the nurses had been unable to keep him inside once he had been deemed clear by the Hokage. He was still pending judgment for his behavior, but it wouldn't do for the village to notice his absence, so he had been allowed to roam free through the village. Naruto fought the urge to look around, knowing there were probably some guards tailing him and that he would not be able to see them unless they wanted him to. The Hokage still needed to come up with the right punishment and for now, Sasuke had been asked not to engage in training exercises and simply wait. It was a good test of patience for him. Naruto tried to push the troubling thoughts away. "Why are you here? I thought you'd be with Kakashi-sensei. I thought I'd come to make sure you didn't get lost on your way through the village." Sasuke looked to the side, but his words lacked the malice they had before. The only thing Naruto could detect was a mocking tone that was more friendly than anything else. "Since you're leaving tomorrow I just wanted to remind you that we're going to spar when you're back, Usura Kachi." Instead of getting angry at the name calling, Naruto smirked and showed Sasuke his clenched fist, ignoring the way Kiba and Neji had stiffened behind him. "You can count on it, Sasuke team. Don't go crying to sensei when I defeat you, though." The Uchiha shook his head, but the way his lips twitched upwards looked more like a smile than a sneer. "You're on," he assured. Naruto smiled back at him, beaming. This was the right thing, and he was glad Sasuke was back to Konoha. The forest seemed empty of life, leaves rustling softly in the breeze, but the appearances were deceiving. A figure moved through the canopy, the pace making the world blur around it, jumping from tree to tree in a straight line, clearly heading north. Its destination was obvious: Konohagakure no Sado. The shinobi's foot barely touched the branches before he sprung forwards, keeping its presence within the shadows, and he left no trace of his passage as he sped onwards with an ability and a speed unrivaled by many. Slowly, with every step closing the distance between him and his destination, the shinobi's shoulders seemed to relax, almost as if he was progressively dropping a heavy weight from them. There was still darkness pooling inside his heart, like a heavy blanket thick with decisions, missions and duties wrapped together and hiding within him. But every step that brought him to Konoha seemed to shed some light on that darkness. There was no hesitation in his steps, only determination. It had been just weeks since he'd last stepped foot in Konoha, but then he had been on a different mission, with a different purpose, and he felt like it had not counted at all. This was different. He was returning, finally and without a doubt, and he was going to stay. Everything he had done in the past was just that from now on the past. It would haunt him, and he would still bear its scars inside himself, but things were going to chance, and he would try to forget about all the what-ifs that lingered around him, like scattered kunai. He had a chance for something like redemption, and he would hold on to that chance without a second thought. He had done enough, even if that thought was only ever admitted in the depths of his mind, never out loud. At least one weight settled on his shoulders was about to be dropped forever, and he was the one closing that door behind himself. As he jumped through a small meadow, sailing into the air from one branch to the other, a pale hand moved to unclasp the vest he wore, undoing each button with steady fingers. The outfit had been on him so long in the past years that he could barely remember a time when he had been without it, a symbol that many had come to associate to him, but that had simply been just a garment to him, reminder of his own choices. What the vest symbolized, he was not, never had been, and now he was free from it. As the cloth finally slipped down his shoulders, he relished the sudden lack of weight, both physically and psychologically. He landed on the next tree and stopped, the branch swaying slightly under his weight as he observed the fabric he was holding, a finger tracing the familiar pattern of crimson clouds against black. That outfit had meant a lot more to him than he could ever admit, not even to himself, both in success and defeat, in pain and relief, and now he was shedding it away, like the useless cocoon of a newly born butterfly. His eyes seemed to grow darker at that thought, face resembling a mask, and he finally relaxed his hold. The vest fell down, flapping wildly without an occupant inside it, but the shinobi was not looking at it. He jumped ahead, distancing himself from the vest and what it meant, and did not look back. The discarded fabric fluttered and fell like a weightless feather, spinning until it hit the lower branches and then the rocks. In the end, it gracelessly floated on the surface of the river underneath, splashing and absorbing the water, growing heavy and wet until the current tugged it away. In a matter of seconds the vest was gone, vanished never to be seen again. The man who had discarded it did not see its end. He had left already, the door slammed close behind his back. It was still a long while before the familiar wall surrounding Konoha appeared in front of him. At the sight, his pace slowed down considerably for a moment and he looked up. The wall was tall, it went higher than the trees, built to keep opponents away and allies safe inside, and the last time he had seen it, he had approached as an enemy would, hiding his identity and slipping inside. This time he paused to appraise it, eyes looking at it as not something built to repel him, but as a welcoming sight. This was home. The place he had belonged to once, or at least the place where he should belong. Even now, buried deep down even deeper than the relief he felt at the sight, a part of him was still somewhat hesitant, even doubtful. He had done so much to be seen as a traitor, he was the first not able to consider this truly home. At least not yet. In the blink of an eye, warned solely by the sound of rustling leaves, the incoming shinobi found himself surrounded by 3 Anbu. He was surrounded, and he paused, one hand pressed on a nearby tree as he glanced from mask to mask with a tired smile. One was a boar, one was a wolf, and one was a parrot. None of the Anbu spoke for a long while, and then one of the 3 stepped forwards, holding an object in his hands, offering it to the newcomer, who did not seem surprised by the gesture. He slowly held out one arm and received what the Anbu was giving him, a brand new Anbu outfit. The fabric of this outfit was lighter in his hold than the one he'd left behind had, and for a moment, the shinobi allowed the familiarity of the clothes to soothe his unsettled mood. This outfit brought forth memories that even at their worst were still brighter and more meaningful than any of the ones he'd created during his period away from the village. If there was an attire that did mean something to him, that was it, a vest that was the only one that could fit him perfectly, a different sort of freedom. Just as he'd done when saying goodbye to his old outfit, fingers gently traced the folds of this new one, gently caressing the outlines with more familiarity and even more care. This belonged to him, and he would never throw it away, never again. After so many years, he would finally be able to wear it proudly. He was back. With no trace of embarrassment whatsoever, the clothes he wore were quickly discarded and replaced with the new outfit. He took his time to feel the fabric as he put it on, feeling like he was receiving a cold shower to clean away all the grime and the dirty from before. It was a ritual he needed, undressing himself of the old masks, only to wear new ones that fit him better. Once he was finally done, a second Anbu stepped towards him, this time holding out what he recognized as his old weapon. He grasped it in a steady grip, marveled at how time had not touched it, despite so many years without it, the blade still as sharp and deadly as before. He sheathed it again, securing it on his back. Finally, the third and last of the Anbu stepped forwards as well, and the object he held out to him was taken without hesitation. The newcomer traced the beautiful outlines of the bird carved upon a white mask. Even after so many years, he had never allowed himself to forget what that mask had meant to him, what it still meant, nor how it felt. With a swift move, the mask was pressed over his face, strings tied behind his head to hold it in place, and with the anonymity of the action came another wave of calming reassurance. The 3 Anbu surrounding him shifted slightly, and although none of them could see the others, they were all smiling. "Welcome back, Death Wings," the boar-masked Anbu stated with a quiet voice. He nodded in reply. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady and controlled. A flicker, and all of them disappeared. The forest was once again silent, the tall walls of Konoha continuing to stand, undisturbed. Tsunade fought valiantly the urge to slam her head on the desk and just lie there until everything finally made sense again. She could not believe this. If it had been anything else and she meant it. Anything, it would have been easier to believe it, but with this she was having a lot of trouble. The evidence was all piled in front of her, stamped thrice with the highest level of security, signed with Saratobi's blood and signature, and yet it still seemed like nothing of it was real. She cleared her throat, trying to look calmer than she felt. "Why was I not alerted of this sooner?" she asked. She should have been angry, this was big, but she was only shocked. "I have been Hokage for a while now, and nothing of this was ever mentioned to me." She hadn't known anything about this. Nobody had, not even Jiraiya, who prided in his in-depth spy network. It was an order from Sandaime-sama. The less people outside Anbu to know, the better. Even inside our troops only very few were warned of this, for protection purposes. Hayu's tone was serious and honest. If anybody were to suspect about anything, the entire mission would have ended in a failure, and he would have died or perhaps faced a fate worse than death. Hayu was the commander of the Anbu, and he had to make decisions regarding his troops every day, but this particular order had been given to him by the deceased Sandaime Hokage, and he had wanted none of it to be told, unless it became necessary for the next Hokage to know. Hayu had followed that order until now, when it had become impossible to keep it hidden any longer. Tsunade groaned. Unfortunately for her, the documents she had been presented were not forged and the Anbu loyalty to the Hokage was unquestionable. If she hadn't been able to recognize the signature and the blood as coming from her predecessor, there were still other methods to prove the authenticity of the documents, including a blood seal, the signature and blood sample of 5 Anbu members, Haidoku included, and the fact that the paper used for the signatures was a specific kind of chakra-infused sheet used to guarantee whatever was signed on it would not be broken. There was no way a document with this level of security and protection could be forged, as to go to such ways to make sure it was secret would be useless. And exactly because of this, Tsunade was faced with a staggering discovery. Everything the village had thought, everything they had thought about, everything was a ruse. Why now? She asked suddenly, looking up at the Anbu commander. If Sarutobi-sensei had ordered this to be kept as a secret, why would you tell me, unless you wanted to? Her eyes widened as she finally added 2 plus 2. Hayu had wanted to reinstall 3 shinobi to Anbu duty, creating what would possibly become Naruto's team. That meant, yes, Hayu confirmed. Under him, that team will probably become Konoha's best. The urge to press her face down onto the desk and not look up until she had enough sake in her body to kill an elephant made it hard for Tsunade to speak but she managed. Was this why you have decided to ask Naruto to join the Anbu troops only now? Was this planned ahead? She paused, then decided to change her line of questioning. What happened to make him abort the plan now and decide to come back? Hayu considered how to answer. The decision to offer Naruto to join us was not recent, no. Whether he had succeeded in his retrieval of the Uchiha boy or not, we would have asked him to join nonetheless, he shrugged. But it was not planned for his team to return because of him, he continued. Dog and Mouse had grown restless and felt they did not do enough for the village, and that is why they asked to come back. Tsunade nodded slowly. She believed him, and there was no reason Hayu would lie to her. He did not know her much, but his loyalty to the village made their interactions easier. He was definitely not against her. As for him, he shouldn't have returned, his mission was to be continued without a deadline, but something happened recently that made me decide to inquire about his position, his safety, and if he had any desire to come back. Tsunade quietly nodded. She could guess what the reasons were, but she did not want to pry. That wasn't important at all. What was really important, aside for the fact that this kind of secret was out in the open for her, was Shizune had discovered her secret stash of sake, and how could she keep on listening without some of that hard liquor? Damn. I can see why you'd have to talk to me about it, she acknowledged. Is he going to be reintroduced to the village or were you planning on keeping him at the Anbu headquarters? What about the Uchiha district and his previous life? Hayu's hands clenched into fists, but the motion went unseen by Tsunade and his voice didn't show any emotion. To serve Konoha and the Hokage, every shinobi knows there are sacrifices to be made. Even after the tragedy, he accepted to give up all that was left for the greater good. There is no life for him to return to other than us. Tsunade slumped on the desk, hiding her face within her hands. So that was it. She guessed she should have seen it coming. She should have known Sarutobi had an ace up his sleeve, and the implications of what she now knew were staggering, and the feeling of helplessness was the worst. When is he expected to return? She massaged her temples. I sent 3 of my subordinates to the Konoha wall to wait for him. As soon as they give him his mask back, he will come here, was the reply. The Anbu commander could not help but feel a bit sorry for the Hokage. He respected her and was aware of the changes she was accepting in order to be the Hokage for her village, but there were things that had been planned by the third, and nobody had expected him to die at the hands of the snake reject like that. Hayu had not even been there. He had been busy with an S-rank mission that had kept him away from the village for over a month, but the moment the news of the Chunin exam had reached his ears, he had hurried to return, only to find the village crumbling under the mounting pressure of the Hokage's death. There were times when Hayu wondered if he would have been able to prevent Sarutobi-sama's death had he been there, but despite his own strength, he would have been no match for a Sannin. Still, if there was something Hayu was famous for, that was his protectiveness towards his subordinates and companions. Anbu members were close to each other, bonding over their secrecy and their loyalty, and they grew to consider the troops as their acquired family. That was why Hayu wanted Naruto to join. Not just because he deserved a chance to be properly trained, but also because he would be offered a place where no one would ever look down at him in hatred. But even this acquired family could not be put above their loyalty to the Hokage and the village, and that was why Hayu had kept the secret of his subordinate for years, keeping the guilt and the helplessness of the situation hidden inside him, determined to remember him the way he had been before he left, before everything was ripped from him. And now, with the third Hokage dead, Hayu had been faced with renewed guilt over his inability to help. That had forced him to rethink some of the plans set in motion by Sandaime, and having him come back was the only chance to further aid Konoha's situation. Both shinobi standing in the Hokage's office stiffened when a chakra signature flared softly, followed by 4 figures appearing in front of the desk, attracting Tsunade's attention. One of them moved to Hayu's side, looking as stiff and proper as the others, and Tsunade had to calm herself as her blood ran cold. This was obviously him. His codename is Death Wings, Hayu said, nodding slightly. As she was faced with the last reinstalled Anbu member, Tsunade had to privately admit to herself that the name, with what she knew of him, was rather appropriate. Hayu's smile stretched fondly under his mask, unseen by the others. His mission is officially aborted, but it will be considered completed, and he is back home. The word home and its undertone meaning were not lost to both Tsunade and the bird mask shinobi, as the first bit her lip and the other stiffened lightly. The word had more power over them than many would guess. Tsunade stared at the mask of the new Anbu for a moment, and she was able to recognize that the pattern wasn't simply that of a bird, but actually depicted a crow. There were many things she wanted to ask, but most of the answers were in the report in front of her, and asking him to voice them would be useless, even if she needed it in his own voice. Even though she couldn't believe it, it was all true. And she had to accept it. She gave him a curt nod, and Death Wings removed his mask with a steady hand, facing the goddamn Hokage with his dark eyes. As she stared at them, without fear of what could happen, they bled crimson, revealing 3 black Tomo inside them. Uchiha Itachi, previously dispatched by orders of the Sandaime Hokage to infiltrate the organization known as Akatsuki, reporting back, he said, tone blank. "Welcome back to Konoha, Uchiha Itachi," she murmured. "Thank you for your hard work." Jiraiya wanted to say something. He really wanted to. Following the plan Hayu had accurately staged in every little detail, he was leading Naruto away from the village. The two would reach one of the nearby towns, where Jiraiya had rented a small apartment that would become the only stable base he had allowed himself to have in the past 40 years. He would not stay idle for 3 years, of course, as most of his information was gathering through his travels, but this was the only viable choice in order to still see Naruto during those years, and it was with a grimace that Jiraiya had admitted to himself that he wanted to be there for the kid. Not because he had to, not because of his promise to Yondaime, but simply because he had started to honestly care about Naruto. He wanted to be there for him as much as he could, and if that meant having an actual tie then so be it. He wasn't too old to change. Hayu had reassured him by saying that since Naruto was still in his growing period, he would be allowed to take time off his Anbu training and duties to follow him for extra training, and Jiraiya was grudgingly grateful for that. The moment they arrived to his base, making Naruto acquainted with it for future purposes, the two would wait for Haidoku's arrival in order to return to Konoha undercover, safely reaching the Anbu hideout while Jiraiya started to extend his network. Everything had been planned out. The white-haired Sennin opened his mouth to speak up, but once again, no words came out. He simply couldn't find anything to say and looked down at the teen walking at his side. He felt useless. Naruto had decided to stay and train with the Anbu instead of coming with him, instead of running away, he reminded himself harshly. What I did when I left Konoha. Planning on never returning if I could, and now he didn't like it. Compared to this new generation, the Sannin were just a bunch of cowards. Jiraiya himself had left the village out of pain and disgust, not accepting the death of his beloved student. He'd seen that person when looking at Naruto, but now it was different. Looking at Naruto didn't bring pain to his heart anymore, now there was only hope and warmth. Naruto had healed him. Tsunade had also left, refusing to accept both of her losses, hiding her pain under her obsessive gambling and drinking. She had returned only because of Naruto, who'd brought her hope as well. Orochimaru had left because he had been denied his desires. His resent had been too great, too strong, he would never come back. Jiraiya knew that not even Naruto could have saved him. It amused him, he now thought of them in terms of those this young teen had hated and those he hadn't. He wondered if Naruto would have even tried with Orochimaru had he been given a chance. But in the end they were simply cowards, each one of them in a different way. Thankfully, Jiraiya and Tsunade had been offered a way out thanks to Naruto. Even after Sasuke's attempted betrayal, even with his being Kyuubi's host, Naruto had always fought hard for everything he'd wanted, fighting for what he believed in. To make up for all the time he'd wasted during Naruto's childhood, now Jiraiya wanted to offer the teen the appreciation, the comfort and the support he needed, and yet, he couldn't speak. He had never been good enough until then. He wasn't good with feelings and emotions. He wasn't good with teenagers Naruto's age. Sennin Jiraiya blinked and shook himself out of his thoughts, looking at Naruto as he spoke. I want you to know that I decided to stay in Konoha, not because I don't like you or the training you offered me. He fought to find the right words, blushing a bit and fumbling around with his hands in agitation. I just think that my place is still in Konoha. I don't know enough of it yet, and he paused. I'm grateful you want to stick around just cause of me. You know. Thanks for that, or something. Jiraiya once again felt at loss. Naruto had managed to surprise him again and had even thanked him for simply sticking around. As easy to please as he was, Naruto wanted to show his appreciation to him for such a small thing because he knew Jiraiya and knew that for the older man, this wasn't just a small thing at all. But Naruto turned around and grabbed Jiraiya's arm, tugging at it insistently. I still want to train with you. Despite your perverted hobbies, I would never refuse your training." He lowered his eyes, his grip on the older man's arm tightening. "I enjoy spending time with you. Even if it's not training, just your company is okay, old man." Jiraiya breathed deeply, then ripped his arm away from Naruto's hold and ruffled his hair so hard Naruto squeaked and tried to escape, but he did not allow him to, only stopping when Naruto's hair resembled a bird nest. The ache within his chest subsided. "And even though you're a damn loudmouth, I'd never take back my offer, brat." He looked away, voice gruff. "Consider yourself the great Jiraiya's only apprentice until the moment you die." Naruto's smile was enough to rival the sun, and Jiraiya cheekily smiled back. Yes. This was going to be okay. Naruto's hands clenched around the mask that Hayu had given him. It was a simple mask, with nothing painted on it, just a blank mask with a pair of holes for the eyes, its surface wide and smooth, but it was the symbol of Naruto's choice, and it was only then that he realized this was going to be his path for the next 3 years. It had still felt a bit like a dream, honestly. He had been afraid to wake up and find out things were not exactly the same, that this was not real. This was his choice. Hayu had arrived at the small house Jiraiya had bought a couple hours after them. He had handed Naruto a sealing scroll with a trainee outfit, slightly different from the actual vest the rest of the Anbu wore, and then had given him his white, unmarred mask. It was then that Naruto finally realized this was not a dream. The Anbu had really given him a choice. He would join the troops, living in Konoha without anyone else knowing, training under one of the best teachers he could ever have, not counting Jiraiya, of course. And maybe, if he was lucky, the people there would not care about his tenant. His hands trembled as he held the mask. "Are you okay, Gaki?" Sensing his emotions, Jiraiya placed one comforting hand on his head and Naruto looked up at him with a smile. Not even a second later he let his instincts take hold and hugged the man tightly, trying to convey all that he was feeling for him to understand. Jiraiya was taken aback, motionless for a few seconds before he returned the hug. He had seen such an action offered only to Iruka in the past, and this time it was for him. "Be sure to come visit me soon, or I might even forget about having an apprentice," he commented with a smile. Naruto snorted. "What happened to me being your only student until I die?" "Cheeky brat," Jiraiya snorted. "Respect your betters or I might as well change my mind." Naruto left the room to put on his new outfit, sighing as he thought he'd have to drop his orange jacket and leave it with Jiraiya. The idea of having to give up on his color was a bit sad, but he knew there were sacrifices to be made. Orange might not have been his favorite color, and more like the only thing he was allowed to buy from shops, but it had become not just his signature, but it had also helped him teach himself stealth during academy time. If he could avoid most jounin while even wearing such bright colors, he would be fine once a ninja. When the teen was out of hearing range, Jiraiya turned towards the Anbu commander and cleared his throat to attract his attention. "Take care of him," he stated seriously, tone final. He could have added much more than that, but he felt it was quite enough. Hayu would understand. The masked man nodded, knowing of the relationship that existed between him and the teen, and respecting it. "I will," he answered, mirroring the Senin's tone. The two strong men stared at each other levelly, before finally nodding. "Say, what about my hair?" Naruto chose that moment to re-enter the room. He still hadn't donned his new mask, but he was already looking completely different. Jiraiya stared. Naruto's frame was thin, but showed the signs of his daily training. Always hidden underneath the orange jumper and his equally baggy pants, he had always seemed chubbier, but that was just appearance. Wearing more fitting clothes, Jiraiya could see his body was developing healthily. Of course he was still young, clinging to the childish fat that would disappear as he passed through puberty, but a good training and a good regime would bring him to a body that could do whatever he wanted with little strain. Something noticeable was that Naruto was a bit short for his age, but unless he hit a growth spurt in the following years, that might be a possible advantage. Shorter center of balance allowed for better stealth, and even if he did grow taller, he would still favor his speed. But most of all, Naruto was wearing normal shinobi clothes and he looked almost professional, with colors that did not stick out like an eyesore. The only thing that did stand out, as Naruto had just mentioned, was his hair color, blonde hair startling against the gray and black outfit. Naruto did not know what to think in regards of his new clothes, they fit him better than his old ones, but he still felt conspicuous like this. As it was common when changing one's entire attire, he felt a bit awkward, but he had to admit that these new clothes felt nice on him and he looked less noticeable, less of an easy prey. He was thankful for the chance to change his clothes with something less flashy, even if said flashy clothes had helped his skills a lot, but he guessed some things were bound to change. He could not rely on luck for everything. He wasn't playing ninja anymore. "I will put a disguising jutsu on you just in case until we reach the Anbu headquarters. You have a few options afterwards. You can use a cloth to tie around your hair, you can cover them with soot during missions outside the headquarter grounds, or you dye them a less showy color." Hayu allowed his amusement to lace his words. "No way I'm putting soot or paint on my hair." Naruto protested loudly, waving his arms in denial. Fabric to cover them sounds good to me. Then he paused and frowned. Why can't I have a jutsu applied on me even during missions? He asked, blinking in curiosity. Good question, Hayu nodded. It's because it's far too easy to detect when a jutsu has been used, no matter how weak the lingering chakra can be, since it has to stick for long periods of time. Unless you are only around civilians who cannot use chakra, it is an option that should be avoided. Besides, should opponents use Kai on you, it would be dispelled far too easily. Naruto nodded, understanding the point. Finally Naruto put on his white mask. At first it felt uncomfortable, pressing against his skin and hard to breathe through. His skin itched and he fought the urge to take it off to scratch at his face. He hoped he'd get used to it soon. If you are ready, then it's better we leave, Hayu told him, forming a series of quick hand seals and placing one finger on Naruto's forehead. Naruto felt the Jinjutsu trickle as it locked on and then he pulled a lock of his hair forwards to check. He was holding dull brown hair. Neat. But the last wave at Jiraiya, Naruto followed his new commander out from the window of the house. Jiraiya had picked a location closer to the borders of the town, right where the forest started, so the two were able to jump right onto the nearest tree and move from there on the canopy. Jiraiya was left alone to watch them go, hands gripping tightly the edge of the window until he couldn't see Naruto anymore. It's the best option, he tried to reassure himself, feeling somewhat lonelier now that Naruto was not with him. It's something he has to do. Turning around, he closed the window and left the house, a small spring to his step. The town was small, but it did have a good onsen that he could visit to cheer himself up. Naruto followed his commander without speaking. He was paying close attention to the way he moved, having long since noticed the way Anbu seemed to move more silently than other shinobi, and not wanting to show his inexperience to the man. He was still awed by the sheer strength he could detect from him, and the way he moved and acted made Naruto subconsciously compare Haidoku with other ninja he had met before. On one side, he seemed to be more restrained, more aware of his own body than other shinobi he had seen were, including not making any unnecessary movement, and Naruto wondered if that was specific of him as a person or requirement to be in the Anbu. Naruto had been able to observe a lot of shinobi of various backgrounds and skills, and one of the first things they were taught at the academy was to move stealthily. His own skills had only started to improve after he had used his clothes as a boost to learn to be more silent, and he still had a lot to learn, but even then, Hayu seemed to be on another level entirely from, say, someone like Ibisu. Kakashi himself moved silently, a testament of his skills and experience, but despite that Naruto could see that even Kakashi lacked something that Hayu possessed, at least in stealth. The commander seemed to be not just quiet but also light on his feet and left almost no trace of his passage. While Naruto himself was not aware that Kakashi had been in Anbu, and so he wouldn't know that he had once taken orders directly under Hayu, he was right in that respect. Hayu's strength maybe wasn't as great as that of other famous shinobi, like Tsunade or Jiraiya, but his speed and stealth were his best traits, and nobody alive came close to even imitating them. After the first couple of miles, Naruto started to worry about the pace set by his commander. It wasn't that his stamina was bad, in fact, his endurance was higher than most shinobi twice his age, but with every step Hayu took, he seemed to move faster than Naruto could follow, and he could not even hope to copy those flexuous movements. Determined to find a way to copy him, Naruto hurried forwards, keeping a close distance with Hayu and observing the way he moved in detail. There was nothing he could see that was different from what he did, and yet there had to be something, because Hayu was still faster. He tried to pace himself differently, taking wider steps and swinging with each jump, but that didn't chance the situation at all, and Hayu's pace wasn't even that different. Was it a matter of strength or style, or the Anbu had taken notice of Naruto's struggles, but he had been doing some observations of his own, so he hadn't done anything to encourage or dissuade Naruto's attempts to copy him. He decided to speak up only when he noticed his companion had started to appear frustrated with his inability to keep up. You shouldn't worry so much about your pace, he called out, breaking the silence and making Naruto look up at him, startled. Hayu slowed down a bit. It is not something you can learn just by looking. Naruto frowned. Why's that? Because it's not the same technique that is taught at the academy, Hayu replied. Rather than trying to imitate something that you find interesting, the best course of action is to always ask. You will not be reprimanded for wanting to learn. Naruto flushed a bit, but nodded. Okay, he replied, a bit subdued. Never to refuse an offer, he perked up. So what's up with your speed? As you might be aware, the academy teaches every one of ninja the roots of our profession. The basic knowledge includes theories, history and weaponry, plus the 3 jutsu required by all trainees who want to become shinobi. Naruto nodded, keeping quiet. The academy serves to prepare ninja, but if they want to grow further, they will have to do it on their own, training under a jounin instructor or with their clans or teammates. What the academy teaches is only a fraction of what serves to make a shinobi, and of that fraction, an even smaller percentage is devoted to stealth and movement. Naruto hummed under his breath, nodding after a moment. It was true. For kids who were not from shinobi families it was harder to learn things, and that was why making friends at the academy was a good thing. Teachers tried to push children together, and even if clans with private styles would not allow their kids to teach outsiders, joint practices were common, and certain things could be taught regardless of family ties. Naruto himself hadn't had much to do with that. Whenever he tried to make a friend, the kid's parents would hurriedly intervene, leaving Naruto behind. Even with kids coming from families who didn't care much about it like the Nara or the Akimichi, Naruto hadn't had much interaction after a certain point. Shikamaru and Choji had been his sort of friends for a while, but then they had been pushed apart for one reason or another. Shikamaru was too lazy, Choji didn't seem interested much in stuff even back then, and then Ino didn't like him as she believed all the lies adults spread about him, and other kids were very vocal about their parents being right about Naruto. He guessed that even for kids who didn't really have anything against him, it would have been hard to find reasons to play with him. In a way, learning about stealth had been exactly like holding chopsticks. He didn't have someone to teach him the right way to do it, but he was a good observer, so he had managed on his own, and when he had started wearing orange, it had turned into a big game, too. Maybe it wasn't exactly orthodox, but it had worked for him. Maybe you have realized that already, but not all kids from your class run the same way, Hayu continued, dragging Naruto's attention back to him. You prefer to brace the weight of your body on your legs and push yourself forwards, arms unresisting against the wind, is that correct? Naruto nodded, looking down at himself. Even if he concentrated on running normally, once he got up to the tree branches he would automatically shift like that, bracing himself against the wind as much as he could. He had never really given much attention to that before. The Inyazuka clan have a similar way of running, and it suits them and their partnership with their dog companions, oftentimes using their arms to give them a sprint forwards. There are different styles that vary from clan to clan, just as there are specific jutsu linked to each family. Hayu glanced over at Naruto to make sure he was following him. He was. Of course, certain things simply work without having to concentrate on them, because in the middle of a chase, you would be hard-pressed to find some attention to spare on your feet, right? Naruto chuckled. He had a pretty clear picture of how it would go if he did that while running on a tree, and face planting on the ground did not seem nice. Still, indulge me, Hayu pointed at Naruto's feet. When you are about to land after each jump, you brace your body for the impact, tense your muscles, ease the abrupt contact between your foot and the branch, and then release the tension as you spring forwards. Naruto had never been one for technicalities, but at Hayu's nod, he slowed down a bit and tried to focus on his own movements, which he had been doing up until then without much consideration. It took him a bit because concentrating on them made him stumble and lose his pace, but he finally managed to follow through for a few jumps and had to admit Hayu had been right. His leg muscles tensed up a split second before he landed somewhere, as did the muscles of his arms, biceps and hands did when he was about to take a hold of a branch. He tried to stop focusing on it and hurried up once again. Yeah, he agreed out loud, thinking Hayu was expecting a reply from him. Isn't that the right way? Is there even a wrong way to do it? Is yours different then? Hayu snorted in amusement. It depends, really. How do you feel after a long day of training and running around? Or while you are in a long-term mission away from Konoha? Naruto shrugged a bit. I'm tired, of course, and my muscles ache, he thought. He said as much. That is because this instinctual way of running causes the tendons and muscles to be in a continuous state of tension. They grow tired and ache due to the constant strain of moving from stiff to relaxed, so the overall speed is reduced, was the reply. Hayu's voice sounded distinctly satisfied. It is a slow but steady way to work on your endurance and strength, and your muscles will grow stronger with time. Not all shinobi find this effective for their training schedules though, or their body types are not fit for such a long-term training, and the setbacks are difficult to overcome at the start. Naruto pursed his lips in wonder. He hadn't thought there could be different ways to train even just the running, he had always thought that would come naturally, and now he was learning that even thinking that was wrong. Being a ninja meant to think about a lot of things, and he was glad someone was taking his time to explain it to him. Say, he started, then belatedly realized that Hayu was acting not just as a teacher, but as his commander, and he froze. Hayu-san, he added after a split second of hesitation, feeling awkward because of the suffix, but not wanting to appear disrespectful. What about your way of running then? How is it different from mine? Hayu smiled behind his mask. Unless we are in a meeting, or in the company of outsiders, or in a mission, you're allowed to call me just Hayu, or Hayu Taichu. I do not like stiff formalities when they are not required, he reassured the teen. As for that, yes. My style of running requires intensive training, just like yours, but an advantage is that it eases the tension in the muscles, allowing you to tire less. Perking up at that, Naruto once again observed Hayu's feet for some clue about this different form of running, looking so intent that Hayu couldn't restrain a chuckle. While Naruto hated studying, he was a master in training and application, so if it was just a matter of practice, he wouldn't mind trying out this new style. If you are really interested, I could explain you, but you will find it harder than the method you use now because it won't be something you do instinctually. If you find out your way fits you better, it would be no good to change it and have to relearn subconscious movements from scratch. Naruto considered that for a moment before shrugging. He didn't mind trying anyway, who knew, maybe it would benefit him. Besides, just learning something new was enough to make him eager to start. Well then. The part you need to focus on is the landing. Whether you are using your hand or your foot to propel you forwards, there is a moment where all your weight will be concentrated there. It is very easy to lose your footing or slip. In order to offer a visual aid to his explanation, Hayu reached out for a branch with his hand, fingers curling around the bark and dangling for a few seconds, his running halted. Nodding to signal he understood, Naruto hurried to look closer at what the commander would do. It was indeed easy to slip and fall, and even seasoned ninja had moments of inattentiveness or fatigue where they miscalculated their strength or the closeness of a branch. He was used to falling because he had done that a lot before starting the academy, but even nowadays he could easily recount more than one occasion where he had been so tired he had fallen from a tree. That was why a lot of his training consisted in exercises to form muscular strength in order to have easy control over his weight whenever he had to put it all on a single spot. Once the muscles were too strained, they'd fail to compensate and result in slipping or falling. Instinctively, you tense up because you feel a branch approach. You consciously know that it will hurt if you are not prepared, and the memory of that pain forces the muscle to tense up. The speed is a constant unless you halt your running or decide to speed up, so it makes the movement even trickier. Without apparent strain, Hayu twisted his body and applied force on his arm, swinging gracefully to the side and landing on a nearby branch. To say that I don't allow my muscles to tense up is easier said than done, especially if you don't know any better. You have to forget about muscle memory and teach your body not to tense up every time you land. Relaxing your muscles, accepting the strain and the impact rather than preparing against it, allows your speed not to decrease whenever you land, and you swing forwards by adding to the next step the strength of the past one, acting like the branch is a trampoline. Ultimately you gain more speed, and your muscles feel less strain. Naruto blinked. As Hayu had said, it was easier said than done. If he were to focus on each jump he'd lose sight of his surroundings, which would leave him completely exposed to any sort of danger. Of course this meant he would have to devote some time training himself into not tensing up, as he couldn't practice this while in battle or while chasing someone. It was tricky, but Naruto always liked a good challenge, and this seemed like a good one. Amused, Hayu decided to offer another tip to the younger shinobi. If you find yourself with some spare time, I'd suggest observing the nature all around you. Each animal has its own habitat, and they all move by instinct. The way they jump and run is the only possible way for them, the only way it could work. Genetics provided them with the best possible choice for their particular habitat, and as such, they don't need to change the way they interact with it in order to have the best possible outcome. Naruto nodded eagerly. For Shinobi, instincts were very important, although not vital. He was used to follow his own most of the time, so Hayu's suggestion was fitting, in a way. He made a mental note to give this animal watching thing a try next time he had some time in his hands. Maybe Tora the cat would let him to follow him around for a while next time. If there was something Naruto was good at, that was practicing, after all. Just remember that you won't know which one suits you best until you have tried them both for a while and compared the results. It is tricky because your usual way takes more time to give results, but mine needs more training to be mastered, and until then you might keep messing things up. Naruto nodded, signaling he understood. It was a choice between keeping on the way he had been or jumping in the dark, almost literally, with a new method. As he was still contemplating it, they reached a meadow that stretched in front of them, devoid of trees. Hayu's pace did not seem to slow down as he moved down from the last branch to run on the grass, and in a couple long steps he was already on the other side, sailing back up in the canopy with Naruto trailing behind. He did indeed notice he had slowed down a bit while falling down from the tree onto the ground, and that cemented in him the desire to try the new method. The way he was starting to see it was simple. His motions were a sum of a lot of actions, jumping, landing, crouching, pushing forwards and jumping again, while Hayu seemed to move in a single, swift motion, apparently at ease. I want to look like that, too, the young shinobi thought fervently. He switched tactic instantly. As he ran across the grass, he took this opportunity to focus on his tense muscles, trying to get them to relax. It wasn't easy, and it took him the whole meadow to get to the point where, even with focusing on them, he could relax his muscles, but at least he was there for now. The meadow ended and he tried to keep himself relaxed as he jumped upwards to the awaiting nearest branch, mind completely focused. It was then that he felt it, for that single moment, as he hovered in midair in the middle of an action, his attention trying to split evenly between the tree in front of him, his muscles trying to tense, the rest of his body and his breathing and a million other things. Naruto felt a wave of excitement. It had been a while since he had felt like this while running, the exhilaration feeling of forgetting everything but this, of being in the middle of learning something and at the same time without expectations. It felt wonderful, and he had missed it. Lost in the unexpected feeling, Naruto forgot to focus on his muscles, and he landed with both his right hand and his left foot on the branch, completing the motion without thinking about it, crouching down and springing forwards without pausing. Shocked at the lack of resistance he felt, Naruto let out a hiss and felt his speed increase slightly. The fact that he had managed, although by chance, to follow Hayu's example made him feel victorious, and she smiled widely under his mask, completely forgetting to keep himself in the same state of focus, and because of that he found the following branch inches away from him, and trying to not panic about it, he tensed up his muscles and landed heavily on it. His muscles sent a wave of pain through his leg, making him wince. He scrambled forwards and managed not to halt his pace, but he returned to his normal running style, chagrined and slightly embarrassed. At least he had tried out the new method, and he could feel the difference right away, just as Hayu had said. Determined to try again, Naruto was so focused on his feet that he didn't even realize Hayu had slowed down again and was now at his side. "Don't overdo it," he warned the teen, his tone amused. "It will take time to learn how to do it seamlessly and without focusing on it too long. Rushing will only break your concentration and make things hurt more. And this is not a suggestion. You will not skip passages just because you want to learn things faster. I won't allow it, not for this exercise, not for anything else." Feeling suddenly nervous, Naruto hastily nodded. Despite the lighter tone the man had used before, it was clear Hayu was serious now. Not that Naruto would skip stuff just because he wanted to hurry. He'd always said he would only reach the top by using the legit road, those weren't empty words, and yet, he had to admit that rushing was his speciality. He often thought outside the box, and he guessed that was okay, but rushing through things meant sloppy learning, and he could see why Hayu was against that. "Naruto, look, we've reached the hideout." Blue eyes snapped up, staring in surprise at his leader and then in front of him. He hadn't realized they were already there, too busy thinking about running and about his muscles. Right there in front of him was a giant structure, vaguely similar in shape to the academy, yet completely different at the same time. It wasn't as tall as the Hokage Tower, but it was large, slithering out of sight behind trees and bushes in both directions. The building had at least 3 floors by what Naruto could see, though he wouldn't know if it had a basement until he checked its interior, and the walls were of a light brown color that easily fit in with the nature surrounding it. It wasn't hard to spot, but he guessed they had passed some sort of genjutsu on the way, and while Naruto was bad at that kind of techniques, he was sure he'd have to learn how to recognize one at least, and soon. As they got closer, Naruto noticed that the building seemed to curve, leaving space to a meadow with some training grounds. The area seemed rather quiet, but that wasn't unexpected. At this time, the Anbu were probably busy doing missions or other things. Further ahead, Naruto could see some smaller structures of the same color, hidden in the foliage. He guessed they could be storage grounds or something. Naruto had never been anywhere near this structure before, even though the place was obviously still within the perimeter of the protective wall around Konoha, but looking at how things were organized, he could see it was like a different place altogether, somewhere private and secluded, only kept for the Anbu and not to be shared. By what he knew of the Anbu, they were a tightly knitted group, and it was obvious since they only took the hardest, higher-ranked missions. They always kept aside from normal shinobi, and with their own training grounds and facilities, he could get why. For someone of Naruto's age though, this simply looked far too cool. "It's huge," he exclaimed, his voice carrying on his excitement for the older man to hear. He couldn't think of anything else to say, overwhelmed by where he was and what that meant. Hayu chuckled amiably. "You're not the first one to say that," he laughed a bit, probably remembering some sort of private joke, and the two finally slowed down their pace, coming to a halt in front of the doors of the main building. In a flash, 3 Anbu members surrounded them.